Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity slows down and stories of the planet unfold in a way that lets you settle in. Tonight, we're stepping back not just years, not just centuries, but hundreds of millions of years. Back to a world that looked nothing like the one outside your window right now, yet one that set the stage for the creatures that would one day rule the land, the sky, and even imagination itself. This is the story of the Triassic, the dawn of the dinosaurs, a time when Earth was reshaping itself after its greatest disaster and quietly laying the foundations for an empire of reptiles. Before we wander through this landscape together, I'd like to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? And what's the world outside your window like? Maybe it's evening and you're winding down. Maybe it's morning and you're just beginning. Or maybe you've lost track of the hour altogether. Fitting, isn't it, to talk about ancient time while each of us sits in our own little moment of it. And if you find this journey soothing, if you enjoy wandering through deep history at this gentler pace, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a like, maybe subscribed. It helps this calm corner of the internet reach others who might also need a quiet way to marvel at the past. So, let's begin. Picture a world just waking from chaos. 60 million years earlier, at the very end of the Permian, Earth suffered its greatest extinction event, sometimes called the Great Dying. Volcanoes had filled the skies with ash, the seas with poison, and most of life simply couldn't survive the onslaught. Entire families of creatures disappeared, from trilobites that had scuttled across the ocean floor for hundreds of millions of years, to forests that turned to ash and left the land barren. It's estimated that more than 90% of species perished. Imagine that. 9 out of 10 living things gone. The planet must have felt empty, stripped back to its bones. Yet in the silence that followed, new opportunities began to grow. The Triassic Period was that moment of slow recovery, where the world pulled itself together again, filling in the gaps with strange experiments in life. The land was almost unrecognisable compared to today. There weren't separate continents spread out across the oceans. There was one giant landmass called Pangaea, a supercontinent that stretched almost from pole to pole, vast enough that much of its interior was far from any ocean. That meant harsh climates, dry deserts in the middle, seasonal rains near the coasts, and extremes of heat and cold that tested whatever species dared to live there. If you were to stand in the middle of Pangaea, the horizon would stretch endlessly with red sand and rocky plains. Forests, where they existed, were patchy and thin compared to the lush greenery we think of later in the Jurassic or Cretaceous. And yet, scattered across these spaces, life was returning, inventing itself anew. The oceans, too, were stirring back to richness. Coral reefs were only beginning to re-establish after collapsing during the extinction, and different creatures moved into roles left vacant by those that had disappeared. The first marine reptiles took to the water, long, slender ichthyosaurs that looked like something between a lizard and a dolphin, darting after schools of fish. Nothosaurs stretched their necks as they swam, paddling with limbs that were halfway to becoming flippers. These early reptiles tested the boundaries of what could live in the sea. It wasn't the familiar ocean of giant whales and sleek sharks we know today, but a testing ground, a place where new forms learned whether they could make a living in the waves. Back on land, the survivors of the Permian had a hard fight. Many were small, quick-moving reptiles that scurried across the hot earth, living off insects and plants that had managed to return. Amphibians, once rulers of swamps, now lingered in the margins, holding on to the wetter patches of land. Among them were giant relatives of salamanders, thick-bodied and wide-mouthed, waiting in rivers to snap up prey. But it was the reptiles that truly began to take over. Freed from competition with so many vanished groups, they spread into every available niche. Some grew armour, heavy scales that acted as protection. Others stretched their limbs and lengthened their strides, starting down a path that would eventually lead to upright walking. It's easy to imagine this period as quiet compared to the drama of later ages, but there was a tension to it. Every species that survived was pushing into new territory, testing what worked and what didn't. The Triassic was an age of experimentation. There were relatives of crocodiles that walked on two legs, small and fast. There were plant-eating reptiles with strange tusks, armoured backs and spikes. There were even early relatives of mammals, small, warm-blooded, fur-covered creatures that hunted insects in the shadows. They weren't dominant yet, but they carried the beginnings of features that would one day become familiar to us. In a sense, the Triassic wasn't just the dawn of dinosaurs, it was also the dawn of us. But dinosaurs themselves were not inevitable. In fact, for much of the Triassic, they were minor players. Small, quick-footed, not particularly impressive compared to their rivals. Other reptile groups seemed more likely candidates for dominance. Crurotarsans, the relatives of crocodiles, came in a staggering range of shapes and sizes, some armoured like tanks, some swift and slender hunters. They filled the roles of predators, grazers, even fish-eaters. If you were a gambler living in that age, you might have put your bet on the crocodile line to take over the world. And for a time, it seemed they might. Yet dinosaurs were there, quietly spreading, keeping low to the ground, darting through undergrowth, feeding, breeding, waiting. They had traits that would serve them well once the world changed again. Their legs were positioned more directly under their bodies, unlike the sprawled stance of many reptiles, which meant they could run longer distances and move more efficiently. Their lungs, though still being studied, may have been more advanced, giving them stamina in hot climates. They weren't the giants yet. They weren't the rulers, but they were ready. The air itself would have felt different to breathe. Oxygen levels in the Triassic were lower than today, making activity more difficult. Creatures had to adapt to thinner air, and this may have shaped their physiology in ways we're still piecing together. Plants, too, were adapting, with conifers spreading widely across the land, forming forests where insects buzzed and early dinosaurs darted between shadows. Ferns and cycads covered the ground, and ginkgo-like trees rose above. It wasn't the greenery of flowers and grasses we know today. Those wouldn't appear until much later. The Triassic landscape was alien, but it was a canvas on which familiar lineages were being painted for the first time. Weather was harsh, shifting dramatically between seasons. Monsoons drenched the coastal regions, while the vast interiors baked in relentless heat. Rivers flooded and then dried, forcing animals to move constantly in search of water. Volcanoes erupted along the seams of Pangaea, filling the air with ash and carbon dioxide. Life had to be resilient, able to endure long droughts, able to migrate, able to adapt. Perhaps that's why dinosaurs, with their efficient bodies and adaptable diets, found footholds others could not. And still, if you were to sit quietly in that world, it might feel strangely empty. Few birds sang because true birds had not yet arrived. Few mammals scurried because they were only beginning to appear in small, timid forms. The forests were quieter, the skies emptier. But in that quiet there was promise. There was potential energy gathering, waiting for the moment when the balance tipped. The Triassic stretched on for tens of millions of years, longer than the time that has passed since humans first stood upright. Whole lifetimes of creatures rose and fell in that span. Some thrived, then disappeared, leaving no descendants. Others lingered in obscurity, waiting for fortune to favour them. Among those were the first true dinosaurs, whose names we know now from fossils, small carnivores like Euraptor, agile hunters with teeth built for slicing. Herrerasaurus, larger and more imposing, stalking through floodplains. Calophysis, slender and numerous, running in packs. These early dinosaurs were not yet kings, but they were laying the groundwork. They carried the blueprints that would eventually produce giants like Brachiosaurus and predators like Tyrannosaurus. But in the Triassic, they were still just another experiment. Every step of recovery after the Permian extinction had been hard won. Ecosystems were fragile, easily thrown into disarray. Entire groups would rise, dominate for a short time, and then vanish when conditions shifted. That fragility would come into play again near the end of the Triassic, when volcanic eruptions and climate shifts struck once more. But before we reach that point, it's worth pausing to appreciate the world that existed in the middle of this long recovery, because this was the stage-setting act. This was where the players entered, found their places, and began the long performance that would unfold across the Mesozoic. And so, as Earth shook off its greatest disaster and began again, the Triassic became a kind of second beginning. For the dinosaurs, it was the first steps toward dominance. For mammals, it was a tentative start in the shadows. For plants and insects, it was a reshaping of landscapes and skies. It was a world in flux, a world of new rules being written. And though it might have looked barren compared to later ages, it was alive with possibilities. When the curtain rose on the Triassic world, it did so against the backdrop of silence. The kind of silence that follows devastation, the kind that lingers after a storm tears down forests, or after a fire has swept through a landscape and left behind nothing but scorched earth. 60 million years before the first dinosaurs took confident steps, the planet had endured what we now call the Permian extinction, the most severe catastrophe life has ever faced. More than 90% of species disappeared, both in the oceans and on land. The scale of the loss is difficult to imagine. Imagine walking through a forest where almost every tree has withered, or looking into the sea where schools of fish once darted, and seeing only a handful of survivors left drifting. That was the Earth at the dawn of the Triassic, a planet stripped of its variety, of its sounds, of its familiar rhythms. The cause of this destruction was not a single asteroid, not a sudden impact like the one that would end the dinosaurs later on, but something more drawn out, though no less deadly. It was fire and gas, heat and suffocation, spreading from the heart of the Earth itself. Vast volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released staggering amounts of lava, ash, and gases into the atmosphere. The Siberian traps, as geologists call them, poured out enough molten rock to bury regions the size of continents. Alongside the heat came gases, carbon dioxide and methane, that warmed the climate, poisoned the oceans, and robbed the atmosphere of its balance. As the seas absorbed these gases, they turned acidic, stripping shells from tiny plankton and collapsing food chains from the bottom up. Oceans warmed, oxygen disappeared from the water, and large zones became deadly to almost anything that entered them. On land, forests burned, rainfall patterns shifted, and deserts spread. The world that emerged was scarred. The ecosystems that had once been lush and diverse were replaced by simpler communities of hardy survivors. The complex coral reefs that had decorated shallow seas were gone, replaced by microbial mats. The dense forests that had shaded rivers were reduced to stunted plants and sparse stands of conifers. Many animals that had seemed invincible, trilobites in the ocean, gorgonopsids on land, simply vanished, never to return. But the story of Earth is one of resilience. Even after its greatest losses, life has always found a way to start again. The Triassic was the long, uneven process of that recovery. Slowly, stubbornly, the planet began to refill itself. Where once the land was barren, new plants took root. Where seas had gone lifeless, new creatures found ways to adapt. The world was not the same, and it would never be the same again, but it was alive, and that was enough. On land, plants were among the first to reclaim territory. Conifers spread across dry landscapes, their needle-like leaves well suited for conserving water in the arid climates that dominated the interiors of Pangaea. Cycads, with their stout trunks and crowns of stiff leaves, rose in clusters. Ginkgo-like trees put out fan-shaped leaves. Odd but effective. Ferns, ever adaptable, carpeted the ground where moisture lingered. These plants were not as lush or as varied as what would come later, but they formed the backbone of ecosystems that could support animals again. Without plants, there could be no herbivores, and without herbivores, no carnivores. So the forests, thin as they were, mattered deeply. Insects followed. They are the great opportunists of Earth, and even after the great dying, they adapted. Beetles gnawed at wood, dragonflies darted over rivers, and primitive flies buzzed through the air. Their presence meant food for small reptiles and amphibians, and food meant stability for predators higher up the chain. Even in the bleakest stretches of time, insects stitched ecosystems back together. The oceans too slowly recovered. Though reefs had collapsed, other creatures stepped into the empty spaces. Mollusks diversified, with ammonites coiling their shells and drifting through waters that had once been silent. Fish began to rebound, testing niches left empty by the collapse of earlier groups. And then came the reptiles that found their way into the seas. Ichthyosaurs, with their long snouts and streamlined bodies, began as awkward swimmers, but soon grew into some of the most graceful predators the oceans had ever seen. Nothosaurs, with limbs half evolved into flippers, patrolled shallows, snapping up prey with sharp teeth. These marine reptiles were not survivors of the old world. They were pioneers of the new, creatures whose ancestors had crawled from the land and found, in the sea, a place worth returning to. On land, animals faced harsher struggles. Amphibians, once rulers of swamps, clung to rivers and lakes but could no longer dominate. Their moist skin and reliance on water left them vulnerable in the hot, dry climates of the Triassic interior. Some, like the giant Timnospondylus, managed to hold on, lurking in rivers like oversized salamanders, but their age of supremacy was over. The reptiles, with their tougher skin and ability to thrive in dry environments, were better suited to the new conditions. And so reptiles rose. Not just one kind of reptile, but many, spreading into forms that seemed experimental, as if life itself was trying out new ideas to see which might work. Some grew heavy armour, thick plates and spikes along their backs. Others grew tall, with long limbs for running across open ground. Some stayed small and nimble, slipping into crevices to escape predators. The variety was astonishing, especially when you consider that only a short time earlier, life had been reduced to its bare minimum. This explosion of forms was the rebound, the counterbalance to loss. It was the Earth saying, here are new shapes, new paths, new possibilities. Among these forms were the ancestors of creatures we would one day recognize. Croc-like reptiles that could gallop on land, some even walking on two legs. Tiny, furred insect eaters that were not yet mammals but were close, carrying the seeds of warm-blooded life within their small bodies. And somewhere among the thicket of forms, small reptiles that would become dinosaurs. At this stage they were unremarkable compared to their neighbours. They did not tower or roar, they skittered, they nipped, they hunted insects or small prey, and they stayed out of the way of larger, more imposing predators. No one looking at them then would have guessed they would one day rule the earth. But they had something that would matter: upright posture, efficient breathing, and adaptability. Qualities that would prove invaluable when the world shifted again. The climate of the early Triassic was harsh. The interior of Pangaea was so far from oceans that it baked in summer heat and froze in winter cold. Rainfall was rare in some places and overwhelming in others. Rivers flooded and dried unpredictably. Volcanoes continued to rumble, belching gases that kept the climate unstable. It was not a forgiving world, but it was a world that rewarded resilience, and resilience is often the seed of success. To imagine this Earth is to picture a place both alien and familiar. Alien, because the arrangement of continents, the species that roamed, the plants that shaded the land were so unlike our own. Familiar, because the cycle of loss and recovery, of destruction followed by renewal, is something we know even in our own time. Forests burn, yet green shoots rise. Storms flood coasts, yet life returns. On a planetary scale, the Triassic was one such renewal, a reminder that even in the wake of devastation, the Earth does not stay empty for long. As millions of years passed, life diversified further. Each generation built upon the survival of the last. What had been fragile and temporary became stable. Predators and prey reached balances, plants spread and seeded soil, insects became pollinators and recyclers, oceans regained layers of complexity. By the Middle Triassic, the planet was no longer just recovering. It was thriving again, though in a new form. And in this new world, the stage was set for dinosaurs to rise, though their moment was still ahead. For now, it was a planet of competition, of rival groups pressing against each other, of ecosystems still vulnerable to collapse but rich enough to test possibilities. Every creature alive then was part of that testing. Some would win and endure for millions of years. Others would vanish quickly, remembered only in the fossils they left behind. That tension gave the Triassic its character. It was not yet the confident age of dinosaurs, nor the stable reign of mammals. It was the in-between, a planet waking from catastrophe, adjusting its balance and setting the foundations for what would come. And so, the silence that followed the great dying slowly filled with sound again. The rustle of conifer needles in dry wind, the buzz of insects above ferns, the splash of a nothosaur in shallow water, the footfalls of small reptiles across dusty soil. They were faint compared to the roar of the Jurassic or the thunder of the Cretaceous, but they mattered. They were proof that Earth had survived its greatest trial. Proof that even after the worst extinction in history, life could not only endure but find ways to flourish once more. If you were to step out onto the land during the Triassic, the first thing you might notice is how raw and open it all felt. The Earth was still rebuilding itself, and everywhere you looked there were reminders of how fragile that process was. The continents were not broken up into the shapes we recognise today. Instead, nearly all of the world's land was fused together into a single vast supercontinent, Pangaea. From horizon to horizon stretched rocky plains, deserts of red sand, scattered patches of forest, and long river valleys where the only real green gathered. Standing in the middle of it, you might have felt small not just in space but in time. The scars of the great dying were still there, yet life was returning, and every blade of fern, every conifer needle was part of a cautious recovery. The edges of Pangaea, where coastlines brushed against warm seas, were the most forgiving places. Here, rainfall was more reliable. Rivers emptied into deltas, and in those damp soils plants grew with more vigour. Conifers stood like sentinels along the shores, their stiff needles catching wind that carried the scent of salt from the ocean. Ferns covered the ground in green mats. Cycads, with their thick trunks and crowns of fronds, grew in clusters. These coastal regions would have felt alive, buzzing with insects, chirping with early reptile calls, and rustling with the movement of amphibians and small reptiles through undergrowth. The air might have carried the sound of splashing as crocodile-like creatures slid into rivers to hunt, or as amphibians surfaced with heavy breaths. For any creature seeking stability, the coasts were the best place to live. Move inland, though, and the picture changed. The heart of Pangaea was so far from the sea that moisture rarely reached it. Rainfall came only in brief, violent bursts, leaving behind long stretches of drought. The land here was painted red by iron-rich sediments, deserts of sand and rock stretching endlessly. Heat shimmered on the horizon, and plants were sparse, scattered in pockets where a spring or seasonal river allowed them to take root. These were harsh places for animals. Waterholes became centres of conflict, drawing creatures together in uneasy truce until the resource dried up again. The soil cracked under the sun, and winds carried dust that scoured everything exposed. Yet even here, life held on. Hardy conifers stood twisted against the elements, and scrappy ferns grew in the shadow of rocks. Small reptiles darted quickly across open ground, their survival depending on speed and endurance. These contrasting environments, lush green shores and arid red deserts, define the Triassic world. They shaped the lives of the creatures that inhabited them, forcing constant adaptation. A reptile born on the coast might live with relative abundance, feeding on insects, hiding among trees, finding water with ease, but venture far into the interior, and survival was an ordeal. Perhaps this tension between abundance and scarcity was part of what spurred evolution forward. In harsh environments, only the most resilient traits could succeed, and those traits would eventually define the creatures that came to dominate. The plants themselves were pioneers of this world. Conifers had a tremendous advantage in dry climates. Their needle-like leaves minimized water loss, and their seeds, protected within cones, could survive difficult conditions until rain returned. Cycads, though less efficient, developed thick trunks that stored nutrients and water, making them well suited for drought. Ginkgos, with their odd fan-shaped leaves, appeared as well, offering a glimpse of lineages that still exist today. Ferns, though delicate, had spores that could travel on the wind and colonize even the smallest patches of soil. Together, these plants painted the land in shades of green, sparse though it was, and provided food for herbivores testing their luck in a recovering ecosystem. Insects thrived in this patchwork landscape. Beetles chewed through decaying wood, recycling nutrients back into the soil. Dragonflies, some larger than the ones we know today, patrolled the skies above rivers, hunting smaller insects in mid-air. Primitive flies and early relatives of grasshoppers flitted among the ferns. Ants and bees had not yet evolved, but the insect world was already diverse enough to provide food for amphibians, reptiles, and early mammal relatives. The buzz of wings, the scrape of mandibles, the rustle of legs in dry grass. These were the sounds that stitched together the quiet landscapes of the Triassic. For the animals that lived in this world, adaptation was everything. Amphibians clung to the wetter regions, where they could keep their skins moist and their eggs safe in water. Some of them grew to impressive sizes, lurking in rivers like modern crocodiles. But they were bound to water, and in the deserts they could not compete. Reptiles, on the other hand, spread everywhere. Their scaly skin protected them from drying out. Their eggs could survive without being laid directly in water, and their bodies could tolerate extremes of heat. It was here, in this red world of deserts and sparse forests, that reptiles truly came into their own. Some reptiles evolved armour, thick plates and spines that discouraged predators. Others developed long legs and could sprint across open ground. A few experimented with semi-upright postures, their limbs angled under their bodies rather than sprawling out to the side. This simple shift gave them greater endurance, letting them walk or run for longer without tiring. Among these were the ancestors of dinosaurs, though at this point they were small and easy to overlook. They darted through undergrowth, hunted insects, and scavenged what they could. To an observer, they would have seemed insignificant next to the larger predators of the day, but their body plan held promise that would later change everything. Herbivores in this world had to make do with tough, fibrous plants. With no grasses or flowering plants yet, diets consisted of ferns, cycads, and conifers. Teeth had to be strong enough to shear through these plants, and digestive systems had to extract every bit of energy from them. Some reptiles developed beak-like mouths for cropping vegetation. Others grew large stomachs to ferment tough plant material. Life in the red deserts was not easy for plant eaters, but it was possible, and wherever they went, predators followed. Carnivores tested new strategies as well. Some, like the ancestors of crocodiles, grew sleek and agile, hunting on land with powerful jaws. Others specialized in ambush, lurking in rivers or shaded areas until prey wandered close. Speed became an advantage in the open plains, and small bipedal predators took advantage of their long legs to chase down victims. These early hunters were not yet the giants of later ages, but they honed skills that would be passed down to their descendants. The skies above the red deserts and green shores were also changing. Flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, first appeared during the Triassic. At first they were small, with wingspans of only a metre or so, but their arrival added a new dimension to ecosystems. They skimmed over rivers, catching fish, or glided above plains in search of insects. Their presence hinted at the aerial drama that would come in later ages, when some would grow to the size of airplanes. But here in the Triassic they were just beginning, another experiment in life's recovery. It's tempting to think of the Triassic as a waiting room for the dinosaurs, but that misses the richness of the world as it was. For tens of millions of years, other groups had their moments of prominence. Crurotarsans, the crocodile relatives, spread into forms so varied that they filled nearly every niche dinosaurs would one day take. Some walked on two legs, others grew into bulky armoured grazers, and still others became sleek predators. They seemed poised for dominance, and if fate had not intervened, perhaps it would have been them rather than the dinosaurs who ruled the Mesozoic. The deserts and forests of the Triassic belonged to them as much as to the small, shadowy dinosaurs that scurried at their feet. The green shores and red deserts created a planet of contrasts, and those contrasts drove evolution. Animals near the coasts adapted to wetter, more stable climates, while those in the interior adapted to drought, heat, and scarcity. The same species might live very differently depending on where they were born, and over time those differences grew. Some lineages split, specialised, and eventually became new species altogether. In this way, the Triassic was a crucible, testing every possibility, discarding the unfit, and refining the survivors into creatures suited for the challenges ahead. The colours of the land told the story. Red deserts stretching under a hot sun marked the struggle and hardship of survival. Green shores, where rivers flowed and plants grew thick, marked the hope of abundance. Life thrived in both, but in different ways, shaped by necessity. That duality defined the Triassic, giving it a character unlike any other period in Earth's history. And as the planet spun on, as seasons passed and climates shifted, the inhabitants of these shores and deserts carved out their existence. They bred, hunted, grazed, and fled. They left footprints in soft mud, bones in dry riverbeds, and impressions in stone. Those traces remain today, the fossils that let us piece together their lives. They remind us that even in a world still scarred by catastrophe, beauty and complexity returned, and they set the stage for what was coming next, the rise of creatures that would not just adapt to the world, but redefine it. When the forests burned and the swamps dried, when the oceans lost their breath and the skies filled with ash, one group of animals endured better than most. They were not the strongest, nor the largest, nor the most intelligent, but they carried within them a resilience that proved decisive. These were the reptiles. In the silence that followed Earth's worst extinction, when so many other lineages had collapsed, reptiles spread outward into the emptiness, taking up the roles left vacant. It wasn't an overnight conquest. It was a slow, uneven rise, but by the time the Triassic was in full swing, they had become the defining life of the land. The reasons for their success were simple, though not obvious at the time. Reptiles had bodies built for dryness. Their scaly skin resisted water loss, unlike the moist skins of amphibians that shriveled under the desert sun. Their eggs were encased in protective shells, which meant they could be laid on land without drying out, freeing them from the dependence on ponds and rivers. Their lungs were more efficient than those of many earlier creatures, allowing them to survive in the low oxygen atmosphere that followed the Permian collapse, and their metabolisms were flexible. They could endure long periods of scarcity, living on less food or slowing their activity when resources were scarce. In a world where survival meant coping with extremes, these traits gave them an edge. At first, it was the small reptiles that carried the torch. Slender-bodied, quick-footed lizards scurried across open ground, snapping up insects and hiding beneath rocks. These were the quiet survivors, filling the smallest of niches, breeding quickly and spreading far. They didn't dominate, but they endured, and endurance mattered most in the fragile early Triassic ecosystems. Over time, larger forms emerged, building on those same advantages. Some reptiles experimented with armour. They grew bony plates embedded in their skin, creating natural shields against predators. These armoured forms were slow-moving but well protected, grazing on the tough conifer leaves that had spread across the land. Their bodies were squat, their movements clumsy, but predators thought twice before attacking them. In fossil beds today we still find their heavy plates, reminders of how defence became a successful strategy in the uncertain world after catastrophe. Others took a different path. Instead of armour, they relied on speed. Long legs, slender bodies and sharp teeth turned them into hunters of the open plains. They could chase down smaller reptiles, insects or amphibians, and their agility let them dart out of danger when larger predators approached. Some of these early hunters stood partially upright, their legs not sprawled to the side like typical reptiles, but angled beneath them, allowing longer strides. This shift in posture was subtle, but it opened a new way of moving that would later be perfected by dinosaurs. In the rivers and lakes, reptilian life adapted as well. Some remained semi-aquatic, with sprawling limbs that let them swim and crawl with equal ease. They hunted fish and amphibians, snapping with long jaws. Others ventured fully into the water, reshaping their limbs into flippers and streamlining their bodies for swimming. These were the ancestors of the great marine reptiles like the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs that would later dominate the seas. Their return to the water showed the versatility of reptilian design. From the hottest deserts to the deepest bays, they found ways to live. One of the most remarkable aspects of this rise was the sheer variety of forms. In the early Triassic, reptiles were not yet the standardized creatures we know today. They were experiments, branching out in every direction. Some had tusks jutting from their mouths, others had crests on their heads, and still others grew bizarre body shapes that look almost imaginary when we reconstruct them. It was as if evolution had thrown open a workshop, filling it with prototypes. Most of those prototypes failed and left no descendants, but a few would prove durable enough to last for millions of years. The crocodile lineage was among the most successful of these experiments. In the Triassic, they weren't the lumbering, water-bound predators we know today. They were diverse and dynamic. Some were slender and two-legged, sprinting hunters that resembled dinosaurs in posture. Others were armoured tanks that browsed plants. Still others lurked in rivers as ambush predators. This variety showed how reptiles could split from a single lineage into multiple roles, competing with one another as much as with other groups. At the time, it was not obvious whether crocodile relatives or the small, unremarkable dinosaurs would become the dominant rulers of the next age. The competition was fierce, and the outcome uncertain. Alongside them lived the early relatives of mammals, though these creatures were still small and overshadowed. They carried warm blood and fur, traits that would one day lead to success, but in the Triassic they were minor players, hunting insects in the shadows and avoiding larger predators. Reptiles, with their sheer variety and numbers, overshadowed them easily. The rise of reptiles in this period wasn't just about dominance. It was about filling the silence left by extinction so thoroughly that few other groups had a chance to break through. The landscapes of the Triassic reflected this shift. In the red deserts of Pangaea, reptiles were often the only visible animals. Tracks pressed into mud that dried under the sun tell us of herds moving across plains, small carnivores trailing behind, and armoured grazers trudging slowly in groups. Along the green shores, reptiles mingled with amphibians and insects, but their numbers and diversity made them the backbone of the ecosystem. When plants grew, reptiles grazed. When reptiles grazed, predators followed. Slowly, food chains rebuilt themselves with reptiles at every level. It's important to remember that this rise did not happen in isolation. The Earth itself was changing, and reptiles adapted to those changes as volcanic eruptions belched gases into the air Climates shifted, and some lineages died out while others adapted. Seasonal rains shaped migrations, forcing reptiles to travel in search of water and food. Predators honed their hunting skills against prey that became tougher or faster. Each adjustment by one group triggered adjustments by another. It was a dance of survival, with reptiles leading the steps. Among the most promising of these early reptiles were those that began to walk fully upright. Instead of sprawling like lizards, they carried their bodies above the ground, their legs straightened beneath them. This posture allowed more efficient movement and freed their lungs from being compressed during each stride, a limitation faced by many sprawling reptiles. These adaptations gave them stamina and speed, qualities that would matter in the open environments of the Triassic. Among them were the earliest dinosaurs, though at this point they were small and easy to overlook. The silence that once hung over the world after the Great Dying had been replaced by the sounds of reptiles reclaiming it, the hiss of scales sliding through dry grass, the crash of armoured bodies moving through conifers, the splash of semi-aquatic hunters diving into rivers. Insects buzzed, amphibians croaked, but the dominant notes belonged to the reptiles. They had risen in the empty world, and their rise was only accelerating. Still, their reign was not secure. The ecosystems of the Triassic were fragile, prone to collapse. Volcanic eruptions, shifting climates, and the competition among rival groups kept the balance unstable. Any lineage could be cut short by a turn of fortune. Yet through it all, reptiles endured. They spread across Pangaea, adapted to coasts, deserts, rivers and forests. They became the main architects of the New World, shaping ecosystems in their image. In this way, the Triassic became the age of reptiles long before it became the age of dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were still small, still waiting their moment, but the groundwork was being laid by their broader reptilian cousins. Every adaptation in posture, every innovation in body design, every new way of moving or eating tested in this time created possibilities. Some of those possibilities would vanish, others would carry forward. Out of that variety, dinosaurs would eventually rise, but for now it was reptiles as a whole who held the earth in their grip. The empty silence had been filled. Life was not as lush or as diverse as it would one day become, but it was resilient, determined, and resourceful. And in that resilience, reptiles found their opportunity. Their rise in the Triassic was not the end of the story, but it was the beginning of a long arc that would carry through the rest of the Mesozoic. From the deserts to the shores, from the rivers to the skies, the world had been reset and reptiles were the ones who pressed play again. The Triassic is often remembered for its deserts and its armoured reptiles, for the crocodile-like hunters and the early experiments in life after catastrophe. But tucked away in the corners of this recovering world were creatures that seemed too small to matter, too fragile to shape history. They were not armoured tanks. They were not the giant predators that roamed river valleys. They were quick-footed, lightly built, and often overlooked. Yet these small footsteps carried with them the potential for something extraordinary. In the dust and undergrowth of the Triassic walked the ancestors of the dinosaurs. At first glance, they would not have seemed impressive. Some were scarcely larger than chickens, darting through conifer shadows in search of insects. Others reached the size of dogs, slender and agile, feeding on small prey and avoiding the notice of larger predators. Their bodies were light, their bones thin, their movements quick. Unlike the sprawling reptiles that shuffled low to the ground, these small animals carried themselves differently. Their legs were placed more directly beneath their bodies, giving them the ability to move with long, efficient strides. When they ran, their torso stayed steady instead of rocking side to side. This posture gave them stamina, letting them cover ground more quickly and more efficiently than many of their rivals. Fossils give us glimpses of these pioneers. Creatures like Eoraptor, found in what is now South America, were among the earliest known dinosaurs. Barely a metre long, it was lightly built, with sharp teeth that suggest it was an omnivore or small carnivore. Herrerasaurus, larger and more formidable, stretched up to 3 meters, a predator that hunted other reptiles with curved claws and slicing jaws. Coelophysis, known from vast bone beds, was slender and long-necked, running in groups and perhaps even coordinating their hunts. These early dinosaurs were not giants. They were not the thunderous figures that would later define the Mesozoic. But they were different, and those differences mattered. Their upright posture freed them from some of the limitations that plagued other reptiles. Many reptiles of the time still moved with a sprawling gait, their limbs extending outward and their bodies held close to the ground. Each stride compressed their lungs, limiting how far and how long they could run. Dinosaurs, by contrast, carried their legs directly under their bodies, like pillars, and their breathing was less restricted. This small anatomical shift may have been one of the keys to their eventual success. It allowed endurance, and in a world where climates were harsh and prey was scattered, endurance could mean survival. Another advantage may have been their metabolism. Evidence suggests that dinosaurs, even these early ones, may have had a higher metabolic rate than many of their contemporaries. They weren't quite like mammals or birds yet, but they were not sluggish either. Their bones show growth rings that indicate steady, active development. Their bodies may have been more efficient at regulating temperature, giving them an edge in environments that swung between extremes of heat and cold. In the deserts of Pangaea, that adaptability could make the difference between thriving and perishing. But perhaps their greatest advantage was versatility. These early dinosaurs came in a variety of forms, each testing a different strategy. Some were carnivores, fast and sharp-toothed, chasing small prey. Others were herbivores, experimenting with beaks and teeth suited for tough plants. Some may have been omnivores, opportunistic feeders that ate whatever they could find. They were not locked into a single role, and this flexibility allowed them to explore niches that other reptiles ignored. It also meant that when ecosystems shifted, they were better prepared to adapt. Still, in the Triassic, dinosaurs were far from dominant. They shared the land with a dazzling array of other reptiles, many of which seemed more powerful. Crurotarsans, the crocodile relatives, grew into large predators that dwarfed the early dinosaurs. Some Triassic reptiles carried armor so thick that even determined hunters could not break through. In many places, dinosaurs were minor components of the ecosystem, small figures darting at the edges while others held the center. But in those small figures lay potential, and history is often shaped not by those who dominate first, but by those who endure. The environments of the Triassic continued to test every creature. Droughts came and went, rivers rose and fell, volcanic eruptions disrupted climates. Each shift killed off some lineages while sparing others. In this constant trial, the small dinosaurs showed their resilience. Their light bodies required less food. Their fast movements let them escape larger predators. Their efficient breathing gave them stamina during hunts or flights. Every generation that survived these tests carried the blueprint forward. Fossil evidence suggests that some of these small dinosaurs lived in groups. Bone beds of Coelophysis, for example, show dozens of individuals buried together, perhaps by a flood. Whether this was coincidence or evidence of social behaviour is debated, but it hints at the possibility that even in the Triassic some dinosaurs were beginning to coordinate. Group living could offer advantages: safety in numbers, more efficient hunting, and better chances of survival for young. If true, it would add yet another layer of adaptability to their toolkit. The smallness of these early dinosaurs should not be underestimated. In ecosystems dominated by larger predators, being small was not a weakness. It meant agility, the ability to slip into spaces that giants could not reach. It meant surviving on insects or small vertebrates that others ignored. It meant faster breeding cycles, allowing populations to rebound after disasters. The giants of later ages would be spectacular, but they were only possible because these small ancestors carried the line through the fragile beginnings. Meanwhile, the very shape of the Earth was influencing their fate. Pangaea's vastness created climates that were extreme and unpredictable. Its size meant that animals had to cover great distances to find water or food. Dinosaurs, with their efficient strides and stamina, were well suited for such journeys. As deserts stretched across the supercontinent's interior, many reptiles struggled, but the small dinosaurs pressed on, their footprints marking paths through dust that would one day be stone. The story of these early steps is also a story of timing. Evolution often depends on chance, being in the right place when conditions shift. The end of the Triassic would bring yet another extinction, triggered by volcanic eruptions and climate change. Many of the dominant reptile groups, including much of the crocodile lineage, would falter. Dinosaurs, already adapted to endurance and efficiency, would survive. Their small footsteps in the Triassic would echo into the Jurassic as the booming strides of giants. But all of that was still ahead. In the Triassic, they were simply survivors, creatures of potential moving quietly beneath the notice of their larger neighbours. When paleontologists uncover their bones today, it is often in fragments, a jaw here, a limb there, a skeleton preserved in river sediment. Yet from these fragments, we can piece together their lives. We see the curve of claws designed for slicing. We see the slender limbs built for running. We see the lightness of their bones, hinting at agility. Each fossil is a reminder that greatness does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it begins in shadows, in silence, in the small steps of creatures that seem ordinary until time reveals their significance. The Triassic was full of these small, unheralded stories, creatures that seemed insignificant but carried futures within them. The first mammals, tiny and furred, skittering through the night. The first pterosaurs, small-winged flyers testing the air, and the first dinosaurs, small-footed, sharp-eyed, building the foundations for an empire. Their destinies were not written yet, but every stride, every hunt, every survival through drought or storm moved them closer to the moment when they would take over. If you had stood on the banks of a Triassic river and watched a group of Chelophysis dash past, you would not have known you were looking at history in motion. They would have seemed like just another set of lizards, quick and restless. But from those footsteps came a dynasty that would rule the Earth for more than 150 million years. Their smallness was temporary. Their destiny was vast. If the deserts and forests of the Triassic belonged to the reptiles of the land, the seas were quickly being claimed by reptiles that had returned to the water. For millions of years after the Great Dying, the oceans were emptier than they had ever been. The Permian extinction had gutted marine ecosystems, wiping out trilobites that had survived for hundreds of millions of years, collapsing coral reefs, and killing most of the fish and invertebrates that had formed the base of oceanic food chains. In those first fragile years of the Triassic, the seas were nearly silent, their surfaces broken only by the occasional survivor. But as time went on, the oceans began to refill, and when they did, it was not the same cast of characters that had ruled before. New predators entered the stage, and many of them carried scales, claws, and above all, teeth. The ichthyosaurs were among the earliest to appear. At first glance, their fossils looked like strange hybrids, something between a lizard and a dolphin. Their ancestors had lived on land but had ventured back into the sea, and once they did, their bodies began to reshape. Limbs flattened into paddles, spines stiffened into rudders, tails bent into fins that pushed them forward. Over time, they became sleek, fast swimmers, perfectly adapted to chasing prey through open waters. Their skulls grew long, filled with sharp teeth for grasping fish. Some species were small, no longer than a human, while others eventually reached lengths of 15 metres, rivaling modern whales. They were not born of the old Permian oceans. They were inventions of the new Triassic seas, and they wasted no time in becoming apex hunters. Sharing the waters were nothosaurs, creatures with long necks, slender bodies, and limbs that seemed caught halfway between walking and swimming. They paddled through shallow seas and coastal lagoons, using their flexible necks to snap at fish. Unlike the ichthyosaurs, they were not fully committed to the water. Some may have hauled themselves onto land to bask or nest, their bodies awkward on the sand but graceful in the water. They were transitional animals, testing what it meant to live between two worlds. In their evolution, we can see the steps that would later give rise to the plesiosaurs, those long-necked giants of the Jurassic seas. But it wasn't only reptiles that thrived in these waters. Ammonites, relatives of squid and octopuses, spread their coiled shells through the oceans. They floated or swam, using jet propulsion to dart away from predators. Their shells came in countless shapes and sizes, spiraled in ways that still fascinate collectors today. They filled a role similar to that of plankton and small fish, forming the base of the food chain, feeding both reptiles and larger fish. Alongside them lived belemnites, straight-shelled cousins that added even more diversity to the cephalopod family. Together, they were the heartbeat of the Triassic seas, endlessly reproducing, endlessly hunted. Fish themselves rebounded too. Sharks, always survivors, reappeared in new forms, their teeth scattered across the seafloor as constant evidence of their presence. Bony fish diversified, filling the seas with shoals that darted in silver flashes. Rays glided across sandy bottoms. The food webs were rebuilding layer by layer, and with each addition the seas grew more complex. Yet it was the reptiles that dominated the imagination of their age. They were spectacular to behold, not just because of their size, but because of the newness of their designs. Ichthyosaurs with massive eyes hunted in deep water, using vision to catch prey in the gloom. Nothosaurs cruised coastlines, their long jaws snapping with precision. Placodonts, another group of marine reptiles, looked almost like reptilian sea cows. They had blunt teeth for crushing shellfish and broad bodies that may have been covered with armour, giving them a turtle-like appearance. Each was an experiment in how to survive in the recovering oceans, and together they created ecosystems as dynamic as any on land. Imagine standing on a Triassic shoreline. The sea stretches out under a sun that beats harshly on the sand. The water is warm, shallows filled with conifers leaning close to the edge. Suddenly the surface ripples as an ichthyosaur breaches, its long body arcing before splashing back down. Nearby, nothosaurs raise their heads from the water, their long necks weaving like serpents as they look for fish. Beneath the surface, schools of ammonites drift, their shells glinting as they spin and dart. Predators circle below, teeth flashing as they strike. The oceans are no longer empty. They're alive again, thrumming with movement and sound. The rise of these predators had a profound impact on life. For every fish that darted through the water, there was a reptile ready to catch it. For every ammonite that spawned by the thousands, there was an ichthyosaur waiting to consume them. This constant pressure kept populations in check and ensured that only the fastest, the most agile, or the most well-defended survived. It was an arms race, teeth against shells, speed against speed. Each side pushed the other to adapt, and through that struggle, life diversified further. What made these marine reptiles so successful was not only their hunting skills, but their ability to thrive in environments that others could not. The oceans of the Triassic were not always stable. Temperatures rose and fell, oxygen levels shifted, volcanic eruptions on land poured ash and gases into the seas, altering their chemistry. Many creatures perished during these fluctuations, but the reptiles endured. Their lungs let them rise above poor oxygen levels in the water. Their mobility let them seek new hunting grounds. Their diversity gave them resilience, for if one lineage faltered, another could step in to fill the role. Some of the most fascinating evidence we have of their lives comes from fossilized stomach contents. In ichthyosaurs, paleontologists have found remains of fish and squid, their last meals preserved in stone. In placodonts, shells of mollusks are crushed flat, testifying to their powerful jaws. These fossils bring the past to life in vivid detail, showing us not just the shape of these animals, but the way they lived, the way they fed, the way they interacted with the world around them. It is easy to imagine these seas as terrifying, filled with nothing but hunters. And to a small fish or an ammonite they were, but they were also vibrant, balanced systems where predators, prey, and plants all had roles. Algae bloomed in sunlit shallows, feeding tiny organisms that in turn fed fish. Coral reefs, though still rebuilding, began to reappear in patches, offering shelter for smaller species. Every niche was slowly filling, every rung of the food ladder being rebuilt. The oceans that teemed with teeth in the Triassic were not just a stage for spectacular reptiles. They were the laboratories of evolution, testing new designs and refining old ones. The ichthyosaurs, with their dolphin-like forms, showed how quickly life could adapt to a marine lifestyle. The nothosaurs and placodonts showed intermediate stages, bridging the gap between land and sea. The ammonites and fish demonstrated the resilience of simpler, prolific life forms. Together they created a world as dynamic beneath the waves as it was on the surface. When we look back today, we often focus on the dinosaurs, the giants that thundered across the land. But the seas of the Triassic deserve equal attention. They were places of innovation, of recovery, of drama. They were where some of the most extraordinary reptiles ever to live began their stories. And while many of these lineages would not survive into later ages, their presence defined the Triassic. The land may have been shaped by small footsteps destined for greatness, but the oceans were already roaring, already teeming with teeth. If the seas of the Triassic belonged to predators with long jaws and rows of teeth, the land offered a different kind of theatre. Step into the forests of this age, and you'd find a world caught between barrenness and recovery, a patchwork of green stretching across the supercontinent of Pangaea. These forests weren't the lush rainforests or flowering meadows we think of today. No oaks, no maples, no grasses, no blossoms. The Triassic forests were alien to our eyes, built from plants that have either vanished or now survive only in scattered corners of the modern world. To walk among them would feel familiar in the way a forest always does, with shade and the rustle of leaves, but also unsettling in its strangeness. And in those groves lived both giants and survivors so small they might have gone unnoticed, yet together they formed the backbone of entire ecosystems. Conifers dominated many landscapes. They were sturdy, water-efficient, and adaptable to the wide swings in climate that characterized the Triassic. Their tall, straight trunks reached upward with branches that carried stiff, needle-like leaves. In the deserts of Pangaea's interior, where rain came in brief bursts and then disappeared for months, these trees thrived. Cycads grew in clusters, their squat trunks topped with crowns of thick, leathery fronds. To modern eyes, they look a little like palm trees, but they are unrelated, relics of an ancient design. Ginkgos added their unique fan-shaped leaves to the mix, a lineage so enduring that they still survive today, often planted in cities, little green echoes of this distant world. On the forest floor, ferns spread in carpets, filling the spaces where sunlight filtered down. This was not a forest of flowers and grass, but of resilience and endurance. Without flowers, pollination depended on wind and insects that adapted to the available plants. Without grasses, the ground was covered by ferns and horsetails, tall reed-like plants that grew near water. The diversity was not as high as in later ages, but what was there was sturdy, enough to support entire communities of animals. Among the trunks and fronds moved creatures of all shapes and sizes. Some of the most striking were the large herbivorous reptiles, browsing on cycads and conifers. Plateosaurus is a good example. It was one of the earliest large dinosaurs, reaching lengths of 9 meters. With a long neck and sturdy body, it fed on plants that smaller animals couldn't reach. It walked on 2 legs, but may have dropped onto all 4s when feeding. Its presence must have been imposing in these forests, one of the first true giants of the dinosaur line. Yet even Plateosaurus was not the dominant herbivore everywhere. Other reptile groups, like the etosaurs, armoured plant-eaters covered in bony plates, browsed low vegetation, their bodies heavy and well protected. Together they filled the role of grazers and browsers, keeping the forests alive with movement. For every giant that trampled through the undergrowth, there were dozens of smaller animals surviving in the shadows. Early mammal relatives, no larger than mice or rats, scurried through ferns. These tiny insect eaters lived in burrows, coming out at night to avoid predators. They carried with them traits that would one day define mammals: fur for warmth, teeth specialized for different foods, and the possibility of warm-blooded metabolism. In the Triassic, they were insignificant in size, but like the small dinosaurs, their destiny lay in the future. For now, they were survivors, holding on through stealth and adaptability. Insects thrived in these forests too. Beetles chewed through wood, dragonflies zipped above streams, and cockroaches scuttled through leaf litter. Without bees or butterflies, pollination relied on wind or simpler insect interactions, but the system worked. Spiders spun webs among cycads, catching unwary flyers. Millipedes crept through damp soil, recycling decaying plant matter. These small lives might not capture attention the way the giants did, but they were essential, maintaining the cycles of growth and decay that kept the forests functioning. Predators, of course, were never far away. Kelophysis, one of the earliest well-known dinosaurs, hunted in packs across floodplains and woodlands. Slender and fast, it grew up to 3 meters long but weighed little, built for speed rather than brute strength. Its sharp teeth and claws made it a danger to small prey, and in groups, it may have been able to bring down larger animals. Imagine the silence of a Triassic evening broken by the rustle of a group of these hunters darting through the ferns, their long tails balancing their bodies as they closed in on their quarry. Other predators included crocodile relatives, some small and agile, others heavy and armoured. Competition was fierce, and survival depended on both skill and luck. What made these forests remarkable was the mix of scales. You had giants like Plateosaurus reaching up into the conifers, medium-sized armoured reptiles browsing at waist height, small dinosaurs darting through the undergrowth, and tiny mammals and insects surviving at ground level. Every layer of the forest was occupied, from the canopy down to the soil. Each size class supported the next, creating webs of interaction that stabilized the ecosystem. Remove one, and the balance would falter, but together they created resilience. The climate shaped these forests as much as the plants and animals did. In coastal areas, rainfall allowed denser vegetation, giving rise to more complex food chains. In the interior, droughts meant forests were sparser, and animals had to migrate to survive. Seasonal monsoons drenched some regions, turning dry valleys into temporary wetlands, which in turn supported explosions of life before drying again. These fluctuations kept every species on edge, rewarding those who could adapt quickly. Giants like Plateosaurus may have travelled long distances to follow the growth of vegetation, while small mammals retreated into burrows during harsh seasons. The forests were never static. They pulsed with the rhythms of climate and survival. Evidence of these interactions comes to us through fossils. Trackways preserved in ancient mud show herds of herbivores moving together, their prints overlapping in the soft ground. Nearby, the smaller prints of predators sometimes follow, hinting at hunts. Fossilized burrows tell us of tiny creatures digging into safety. Coprolites, fossilized droppings, reveal diets, filled with plant fragments or bone shards. These details bring the forests of the Triassic to life, reminding us that they were not just collections of strange plants and animals, but living systems, buzzing with activity. Among the strangest giants of these forests were not even dinosaurs, but relatives of crocodiles. Some of these creatures grew massive, with heads shaped for crushing or slicing, and bodies covered in armour. They looked formidable, and for much of the Triassic they were competitors to dinosaurs for dominance. But while they thrived for a time, their lineages would falter at the end of the period, leaving the stage open for dinosaurs to expand. The forests of the Triassic were places of transition. They were not as lush as later Jurassic jungles, nor as empty as the early post-extinction landscapes. They were somewhere in between, testing new balances, building complexity layer by layer. Strange giants and tiny survivors lived side by side, each dependent on the other in ways they could never have known. Without the giants, the plants might have grown unchecked. Without the tiny creatures recycling nutrients, the soil would have become barren. Every scale mattered. Walking through one of these forests, you might feel both awe and unease, awe at the sight of a plateosaurus reaching high into a conifer, or a herd of armoured etosaurs shuffling through cycads. Unease at the strangeness of the plants, at the alien quality of ginkgos and cycads, at the realization that no bird would sing in the branches, no flower would bloom at your feet. The Triassic forests were familiar enough to remind you of home, yet alien enough to remind you just how distant this world truly was. And yet, it was in these forests, among these plants and creatures, that the stage for the Mesozoic was set. The giants were learning to be giants. The small survivors were proving their resilience. The balance of predator and prey was stabilizing. Each step forward was a rehearsal for the ages to come. The forests of strange giants and tiny survivors were not just ecosystems of their time. They were blueprints for the world that would follow. When we think of the Triassic, our minds often go first to the reptiles, the early dinosaurs, the armoured giants that trudged across dry plains, or the sharp-toothed hunters that chased them. But life is never made up only of the largest figures. It is built on countless smaller voices, the quieter ones that hum beneath the surface of every ecosystem. In the Triassic, these voices came from insects and amphibians, from the creatures that filled the air with buzzes and clicks, from the ones that croaked and splashed in rivers, from the hidden multitude that formed the true chorus of the age. To understand this period fully, you have to bend down, peer closer, and listen to that chorus. Insects had survived the Great Dying better than many groups, though they too lost entire lineages. By the Triassic, they were rebuilding quickly, seizing niches left open by the collapse of other creatures. Beetles, already ancient by then, thrived as recyclers, chewing their way through decaying wood and plant matter. They helped return nutrients to the soil, a process essential for the forest struggling to recover. Dragonflies, with their long wings and compound eyes, hunted across rivers and lakes, swooping down on smaller insects with practiced precision. Some were modest in size, others grew large enough to rival a human handspan, reminders of an earlier time when oxygen levels had been higher and insects had grown even larger. Flies and early relatives of grasshoppers added their presence too. They filled the skies with movement, their buzzing a constant background sound to the forests and plains. Though bees and butterflies had not yet evolved, pollination still happened through wind, through primitive insect interactions, and through sheer abundance. Ants, termites, and many other insect families we know today had not yet appeared, but the groundwork for their future roles was being laid. Insects in the Triassic were explorers of opportunity, finding food wherever it existed, and reproducing in numbers large enough to ensure survival through even the harshest seasons. Spiders, scorpions, and their kin also flourished. Spiders spun webs among cycads and ferns, catching careless flyers. Scorpions stalked the forest floor, their pincers clacking as they sought prey. Millipedes and centipedes crept through leaf litter, breaking down detritus and feeding on smaller animals. Together, these invertebrates created a buzzing, crawling, rustling undercurrent of life that might not have caught the eye like a plateosaurus, but mattered just as much in keeping ecosystems stable. If insects carried the pulse of the Triassic air, amphibians carried the voice of its waters. Amphibians had been dominant in earlier ages, when swamps stretched across continents and rivers teemed with life. The Great Dying had struck them hard, but enough survived to linger into the Triassic. In many places they remained impressive. Giant temnospondyls, relatives of salamanders and frogs, reached lengths of 5 meters or more. They lurked in rivers and lakes, their wide jaws snapping shut on fish or unwary reptiles. With their squat bodies and sprawling limbs, They looked ungainly on land, but were formidable in the water. Imagine a still Triassic pond, dragonflies hovering above and beneath the surface, a shadowy bulk waiting to lunge. That was the world of the amphibians. Yet these giants were not secure. The Triassic was harsher and drier than the swampy worlds of the Permian and Carboniferous. Amphibians, bound by their moist skins and reliance on water for reproduction, struggled in the arid interiors of Pangaea. They clung to rivers, lakes and wetlands, but outside those refuges reptiles claimed the land. Still, where water was reliable, amphibians remained a force, and their croaks and calls must have filled Triassic evenings, adding their notes to the dawn and dusk chorus. Smaller amphibians, closer to what we think of as frogs or salamanders, also survived. They lived in the shadows of forests, in the shallows of streams, darting after insects. They may have bred in seasonal pools, laying eggs that hatched into tadpoles, repeating life cycles that still exist today. These creatures were not dominant in their ecosystems, but they persisted. Their very presence after the devastation of the Permian was proof of resilience. The interplay between insects and amphibians shaped entire environments. Insects provided food, buzzing and crawling in such numbers that they could support whole communities of predators. Amphibians, in turn, kept insect populations in check, swallowing flies, beetles and smaller arthropods in great numbers. Reptiles joined in this feast too, snapping at insects in the air or on the ground, but amphibians carried much of that burden in wetter regions. It was a balance, fragile yet effective, and it kept the chorus of the Triassic in tune. In some regions, seasonal rains transformed landscapes. Dry valleys became wetlands, bursting with insect swarms. Amphibians emerged from burrows or riverbanks to breed in these brief windows, their croaks echoing across the water. Reptiles gathered too, feeding on the abundance. Then the rains would fade, the pools would dry, and silence would return until the next cycle. These rhythms of feast and famine drove behaviour, migration, and survival strategies. To live in the Triassic meant learning to adapt not just to predators, but to the pulse of the climate itself. Fossil evidence gives us hints of this chorus. Insects are preserved in delicate detail, their wings imprinted in stone, their bodies trapped in ancient sediments. Amphibian skeletons, often found in what were once riverbeds, show us their size and shape. Trace fossils like burrows and trackways remind us that they were active participants in their environments, not just isolated specimens. Together, these fossils let us reconstruct the soundscape of the Triassic, even if the actual sounds are lost. We can imagine the whine of insects, the splash of amphibians, the rustle of predators moving in response. It is tempting to overlook these creatures when focusing on the grand arc of history. Dinosaurs rose to dominance, reptiles diversified, mammals crept quietly in the shadows. But without the insects and amphibians, those larger stories could not have happened. They were the foundation, the chorus that kept ecosystems alive and balanced. Every plateosaurus that grew to towering size depended on plants nourished by soil, enriched by insects. Every Colophysis that hunted in packs relied on insect-fed prey to sustain them. Every reptile that thrived near water lived alongside amphibians that shaped those habitats. The giants may have taken the spotlight, but the chorus kept the play running. The Triassic dawn chorus would not have sounded like the bird-filled mornings we know. True birds had not yet evolved, and their songs were millions of years in the future. Instead, mornings in the Triassic forests began with the buzz of insects warming in the sun, the croaks of amphibians hidden in ponds, and the scuttling of countless small creatures starting their day. Evenings ended with the same as insects swarmed in the fading light and amphibians called across rivers. It was quieter, more primitive perhaps, but it was life's way of announcing its persistence, and in that persistence lay the promise of what was to come. The insects of the Triassic would give rise to the bees, ants and butterflies of later ages, reshaping pollination and ecosystems. The amphibians that survived would eventually shrink in scale, no longer giants but smaller forms that still thrive today. Their calls still echo in our own time, faint reminders of a world long gone. The dawn chorus of the Triassic may have sounded alien, but it is not entirely lost. We still hear fragments of it on summer nights and quiet mornings when insects hum and frogs croak, carrying threads of continuity across hundreds of millions of years. One of the most fascinating questions about the Triassic is not only who lived there, but how they lived. In a world of deserts and droughts, of extremes of heat and cold, of unstable climates still reeling from past catastrophe, survival meant more than teeth and armour. It meant physiology, how animals generated and controlled their energy, how they breathed, how they stayed warm or cool, how they kept moving when resources ran thin. And in the Triassic, something remarkable seems to have been happening. Among the countless reptiles, amphibians, insects and early mammals, the first signs of warm-blooded life were beginning to show. Most reptiles are ectothermic, which means they rely on their environment for heat. They bask in the sun to warm up, they slow down in the cold, and their activity levels depend heavily on the temperature around them. This worked well for millions of years, and it still works today for lizards, snakes and crocodiles. But in the harsh climates of the Triassic, with baking deserts by day and cold nights in the interior of Pangaea, being tied to the sun was not always ideal. Animals that could generate more of their own heat, that could keep their bodies running regardless of the chill of evening or the shadow of a storm, had an advantage. The first hints of this shift can be seen in the mammal-like reptiles, the synapsids. These were the distant ancestors of true mammals, and in the Triassic they were still small, rodent-sized insectivores scurrying through undergrowth. Their bones tell us intriguing things. Many had differentiated teeth, incisors, canines, and molars, suggesting varied diets and active lifestyles. Some had whisker-like structures hinted at in fossil impressions, which in turn suggest the presence of fur. Fur, after all, doesn't make much sense unless an animal is already warm-blooded or close to it, since its purpose is to retain internally generated heat. These small creatures may not have been fully endothermic yet, but they were leaning toward it, experimenting with a new way of living. Among dinosaurs, the picture is less certain, but no less compelling. Evidence suggests that even the earliest dinosaurs may have had more efficient respiratory systems than their reptilian rivals. Their bones, hollow in places, hint at air sacs similar to those in modern birds, which allow for a continuous flow of oxygen through the lungs. Such a system is far more efficient than the tidal breathing of most reptiles, and it supports high activity levels. Combine that with upright posture and the ability to run long distances, and you begin to see a physiology more like a warm-blooded creature than a cold-blooded one. This possibility changes how we imagine them. Instead of sluggish lizards baking in the sun, these small early dinosaurs might have been active at dawn, at dusk, even at night. They could chase prey in cooler hours, escape predators under starlight, and keep moving long after other reptiles slowed. Their small bodies, constantly burning energy, would have required frequent feeding, but that too fits with the evidence. Omnivores like Eoraptor could nibble plants and chase insects, filling their energy needs from multiple sources. Carnivores like Halophysis may have hunted in packs, sharing the labour of catching prey. Being warm-blooded is expensive in terms of food, but it pays off in freedom. The climate of the Triassic made this freedom invaluable. Pangaea's size meant that much of its interior was dry and extreme. Days could be blistering, nights freezing. Rain came in unpredictable bursts. In such conditions, cold-blooded animals faced limits. They basked when the sun rose, but when the night chilled the air, their bodies slowed. For them, activity was tied to cycles beyond their control, but a warm-blooded creature could keep going, foraging at night, migrating across long distances, enduring temperature swings. It could push into niches that others could not. This shift did not mean that cold-blooded reptiles were doomed. Crocodile relatives thrived throughout the Triassic, many as agile predators. turtles and lizards continued their success, but it opened doors for new kinds of life. Small mammal-like creatures survived where larger reptiles might have starved. Dinosaurs with efficient lungs and possible elevated metabolisms spread steadily. It was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual shift, tested in countless forms. Fossils provide tantalizing clues. Bone histology, the microscopic structure of bones, shows growth patterns that can hint at metabolism. In many Triassic dinosaurs and synapsids, these bones suggest fast, continuous growth, unlike the slower, seasonal growth of most reptiles. This pattern matches what we see in warm-blooded animals today. Isotopic analysis of fossilized remains has also been used to suggest stable internal temperatures in some species. These lines of evidence are debated, but together they paint a picture of experimentation, of physiology in transition. Warm-bloodedness also had implications for behaviour. Active metabolisms require care for offspring, since young cannot survive long without energy input. Some Triassic synapsids may have nursed their young with milk-like secretions, a behaviour that would later define mammals. Dinosaurs may have guarded nests, as their later relatives certainly did. Social behaviours, group hunting, parental care. All of these may have roots in the physiological demands of warm-blooded life. If you burn energy constantly, you cannot afford to lose young carelessly. You must protect them, invest in them, ensure their survival. The presence of fur or feathers or feather-like structures also becomes more likely in this context. Fur in synapsids retained heat. Feathers in early dinosaurs may have done the same long before they were used for flight. Fossil impressions from slightly later periods show that small dinosaurs carried simple, feather-like filaments, insulating their bodies. It is not hard to imagine that the groundwork for this was being laid in the Triassic, with small, agile predators and omnivores already experimenting with such coverings. To touch one of these creatures might have felt less like touching a lizard and more like brushing against a bird or a mammal. Why does this matter? Because physiology shaped the trajectory of life. The small mammal-like synapsids survived because they could live in niches cold-blooded reptiles could not. The early dinosaurs survived the Triassic's harsh shifts because their stamina and adaptability let them endure where others failed. Warm-bloodedness, or something close to it, was not just a trait. It was a strategy, one that tipped the balance when mass extinction struck again at the end of the Triassic. The cold world of the Triassic tested every form of life. Those tied too closely to external conditions often struggled. Those with the flexibility to generate their own heat, to keep moving through extremes, had a better chance. It was not an easy existence. Warm-blooded creatures had to eat constantly to fuel their engines, but those engines carried them forward into dawns and dusks when the chorus of insects buzzed and the amphibians croaked, into nights when predators stalked and prey hid. The Triassic was a proving ground, and warm blood was one of the tools that proved most effective. Looking back, we can see the outlines of the future here. The small furred synapsids would one day give rise to mammals. The lightly feathered dinosaurs would become the birds that fill our skies. Warm-bloodedness would spread, becoming one of the most successful strategies in the history of life. But in the Triassic, it was only beginning, an experiment carried by small footsteps and light bodies, by creatures that might have gone unnoticed. In their hearts, in their blood, the world was changing, and that change would ripple forward into every age to come. When people think of dinosaurs, the mind leaps to colossal figures, towering sauropods that stretched like moving skyscrapers, horned ceratopsians that clashed in dramatic battles, or tyrannosaurs whose teeth alone could dwarf a human hand. But in the Triassic, dinosaurs were none of those things yet. Their dynasty, the one that would one day dominate the Earth for more than 150 million years, began not with thunderous footsteps, but with a handful of small, often overlooked creatures. Their rise was fragile, uncertain, and far from guaranteed. The world they inherited was still turbulent, shaped by competition with other reptiles and by climates that tested survival daily. To see dinosaurs at this stage is to witness a dynasty in its infancy, teetering on the edge between obscurity and eventual greatness. The earliest dinosaurs appeared around 230 million years ago, in the middle of the Triassic. They emerged in what is now South America, a region that in those days formed part of the vast interior of Pangaea. Their fossils, preserved in ancient riverbeds and floodplains, reveal animals that were small, lightly built, and adapted for speed. Eoraptor is one such fossil, barely a metre long. Its delicate frame suggests it was not a predator of large prey, but an opportunist, feeding on insects, small vertebrates, and perhaps plants as well. It was a creature of versatility, an attribute that likely helped its kind endure. Herrerasaurus, slightly younger and much larger, reached up to 3 meters in length. With sharp teeth and powerful limbs, it was one of the first true predators of the dinosaur line, showing that even in these early days, dinosaurs were testing different ecological roles. But dinosaurs did not exist in isolation. They were only one of many reptile groups vying for space in the recovering ecosystems of the Triassic. Crurotarsans, the relatives of crocodiles, were among their fiercest competitors. These animals were astonishingly diverse, filling niches that dinosaurs would later claim. Some walked on 2 legs, others were armoured plant-eaters, still others resembled sleek predators. In many ways, it seemed as though the Crurotarsans were destined to dominate. They were abundant, they were adaptable, and for much of the Triassic, they overshadowed the dinosaurs entirely. This is what makes the beginnings of the dinosaur dynasty so precarious. In the Triassic, they were minor players, often confined to the margins of ecosystems. Their small size made them fast but also vulnerable. Larger predators could easily overpower them, and herbivorous reptiles with armour and bulk were often safer choices for surviving droughts and predators alike. If history had taken only a slightly different turn, dinosaurs might have remained footnotes, never rising beyond these modest forms. What set them apart, however, were a few key innovations. Their upright posture, with legs placed directly beneath the body, allowed them to move more efficiently than sprawling reptiles. This gave them stamina, the ability to chase prey or migrate long distances in ways that other reptiles could not match. Their skeletal structures, lightweight yet strong, let them run quickly and change direction with agility. Their lungs, possibly supported by early air sacs, provided a steady flow of oxygen. These traits, individually small, combined into an edge that made them resilient when ecosystems shifted. Fossil trackways offer glimpses of these beginnings. In Argentina's Isigualasto Formation, the preserved footprints of early dinosaurs reveal how they walked and ran, their strides narrow and efficient compared to their competitors. These prints are delicate compared to the heavier tracks of armoured reptiles, but they tell the story of movement, of light bodies pressing into soft mud, of survival through speed. Each print is a marker of potential, the kind of evidence that shows us how something so fragile could become enduring. Still, for millions of years, the dinosaur lineage remained in the shadows. The Triassic world was dominated by other reptiles, and dinosaurs had to find ways to exist alongside them without being overwhelmed. Some took to hunting small prey, staying out of the way of larger predators. Others focused on plants, nibbling low vegetation while armoured herbivores handled tougher, higher-growing material. They were opportunists, carving out niches wherever they could, never quite dominating but never disappearing either. It was this persistence that allowed them to endure. The fragility of their beginnings is also clear in the fossil record's gaps. For every early dinosaur we have discovered, there are likely dozens of species lost to time, animals that lived and died without leaving behind remains we can find. Many of these lineages may have vanished without descendants, experiments that failed. The ones we know, Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus, Curlophysis, are only the survivors that happen to leave evidence. Their rarity in the fossil record mirrors their rarity in the ecosystems of their time. They were not yet the rulers of Earth. They were small voices in a crowded chorus. The climate of the Triassic added to the uncertainty. Long droughts tested herbivores, forcing migrations and die-offs. Sudden floods buried entire communities. Volcanic eruptions reshaped landscapes and filled skies with ash. For small dinosaurs, survival meant flexibility. They could move when conditions worsened, feed on a wider variety of food than some specialists, and reproduce quickly enough to rebound after population crashes. Their fragility was also their strength. Being small made them vulnerable, but it also made them adaptable, and adaptability is often the seed of success. By the late Triassic, these fragile beginnings were poised on the edge of transformation. The ecosystems of Pangaea were increasingly complex, with predators, herbivores and omnivores testing every niche. The competition between dinosaurs and crocodile relatives remained fierce. But then came another crisis, the end-Triassic extinction. Triggered by massive volcanic eruptions associated with the breakup of Pangaea, this extinction reshaped the world yet again. Many of the dominant reptile groups, including much of the Cruratacean diversity, were wiped out. Dinosaurs, with their resilience and adaptability, survived. In the aftermath, the balance shifted. The dynasty that had begun so humbly, so uncertainly, suddenly found itself with room to expand. This is the great irony of the Triassic. For tens of millions of years, dinosaurs were fragile, peripheral creatures, overshadowed by stronger, larger, more dominant rivals. Their survival seemed precarious, their future limited. Yet when catastrophe struck again, it was precisely their smallness, their flexibility, their efficiency that allowed them to endure. They inherited the Earth not because they were destined to, but because they had the right traits at the right time. From those fragile beginnings, an empire arose. It's worth remembering this when looking back. The thunderous dinosaurs of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, the giants that defined entire ecosystems, were built on a foundation of small, almost forgettable creatures. Their dynasty began in fragility, in obscurity, in the quiet persistence of animals that refused to vanish. Every colossal sauropod, every armoured stegosaur, every fearsome tyrannosaur carried within it the legacy of those first tentative steps in the Triassic. Without them, the Mesozoic would have been a different story. So when we imagine the Triassic, we should not only picture deserts of red sand and forests of conifers, not only ichthyosaurs cutting through the seas, or crocodile kin patrolling floodplains. We should also picture the small dinosaurs darting through shadows, their footsteps light, their presence easy to overlook. Those fragile beginnings, scattered across South America and beyond, were the first sparks of a dynasty that would burn for millions upon millions of years. When you peel back the layers of the Triassic and look closely at the very first dinosaurs, you don't find monsters or giants. You don't find titans that ruled the earth, or creatures that left whole continents trembling under their footsteps. What you find are pioneers, small and often vulnerable, testing the possibilities of a new body plan. Their names, Iraptor, Herrerasaurus and others like them, have become familiar to paleontologists, but in their own time they were just part of the background, one more set of reptiles in a crowded world. To us they represent the beginnings of something vast, but to the Triassic itself they were experiments, creatures whose success was anything but certain. Iraptor is often placed near the very base of the dinosaur family tree. Its fossils, discovered in Argentina's Ishigualasto Formation, tell us of an animal about the size of a medium dog, no more than a metre long. Its body was light and agile, built for quick movements. Its teeth were a mix, some sharp and curved, suited for meat, and others more leaf-shaped, which may have been useful for plants. This mixture suggests it was an omnivore, opportunistic rather than specialised. That adaptability might have been what allowed it to survive in the harsh and shifting landscapes of the late Triassic. It didn't dominate, but it found food wherever it could, and in ecosystems still fragile from earlier catastrophes, that counted for a lot. Herrerasaurus, found in the same region, tells a different story. Larger, more robust, and clearly carnivorous, it reached lengths of around 3 meters. Its skull was long and lined with sharp, serrated teeth, perfect for slicing flesh. Its arms were strong, tipped with claws that could grasp prey, while its legs were built for speed. Herrerasaurus was one of the first true dinosaur predators, a hunter that combined agility with power. But even it was not the apex predator of its world. Crurotarsans and other reptile groups often overshadowed it, filling many of the roles we might expect dinosaurs to dominate. Herrerasaurus was significant not because it ruled, but because it represented the potential for dinosaurs to become serious hunters in the ages to come. Chelophysis, another Triassic pioneer, is known from thousands of fossil specimens in what is now North America. Slender, long-necked, and fast, it grew to about 3 meters but remained lightly built, weighing far less than its size suggests. Fossil evidence points to the possibility that Chelophysis lived in groups, perhaps even hunting cooperatively, or at least gathering in large numbers. Some bone beds preserve dozens, even hundreds, of individuals buried together, possibly by floods. Whether they truly hunted as packs, or simply congregated in favourable areas, their sheer numbers suggest that these early dinosaurs had already discovered the advantages of social behaviour. Each of these pioneers reveals something about the earliest dinosaurs. They were not rulers yet. They were small, light, and often on the margins of their ecosystems. But they were experimenting with traits that would later become hallmarks of the group. Upright posture, efficient breathing, light skeletons, speed, versatility of diet. These were being tested in real time. Evolution doesn't plan ahead. It throws possibilities into the world and most fail, but in Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus, and Chelophysis, we can see the outlines of what would later succeed. Their world was not an easy one. The Isigualasto Formation, where Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus lived, was a floodplain subject to seasonal shifts. Torrential rains turned dry valleys into rivers, drowning animals in sudden floods. Droughts baked the land in between, testing every creature's resilience. Predators prowled, from larger crocodile relatives to other reptilian hunters. Herbivores like the armoured etosaurs and early sauropodomorphs fed on conifers and cycads, competing with smaller plant-eating dinosaurs. For a creature like Eoraptor, survival meant avoiding predators, eating whatever was available, and reproducing before disaster struck. For Herrerasaurus, it meant chasing prey across unstable landscapes, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing. Their lives were precarious and their success fragile. But their very presence marked something new. These were not just reptiles. Their anatomy was different, their posture more efficient, their lungs possibly more advanced. They were pushing into a new evolutionary space, one that would prove resilient when the end of the Triassic reshaped the Earth once again. At the time, their significance was invisible. They were just small hunters and foragers among many. Only in hindsight can we see that their bodies carried the blueprint for a dynasty. The diversity of these early dinosaurs also reminds us that the line between success and failure was thin. Many Triassic dinosaurs left no descendants. They were experiments that ended when climates shifted, or when competitors outpaced them. Herrerasaurus, for example, seems to have been part of a lineage that eventually died out, leaving no direct heirs. Eoraptor's exact place in the family tree is still debated, with some paleontologists arguing that it was close to the ancestors of all dinosaurs, while others suggest it belonged only to one branch. What matters is not that these species lasted, but that they represented the trial and error process through which dinosaurs as a group found their footing. The fossil record captures some of these fragile stories in vivid detail. In Chelophysis, for example, paleontologists once thought they had evidence of cannibalism, juveniles preserved inside the stomachs of adults. Later studies suggested these remains may have been misinterpreted, but the idea itself speaks to how precarious life was. In times of scarcity, even desperate strategies might have been attempted. Whether or not Coelophysis actually ate its young, the possibility illustrates the thin line between survival and collapse in the Triassic world. Pioneers like Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus, and Coelophysis were never guaranteed a future. Their success depended on countless factors, from climate shifts to volcanic eruptions to competition with other reptiles. Yet through them, dinosaurs tested the strategies that would carry their descendants into the Jurassic. When the end-Triassic extinction swept away many of their rivals, these traits gave them the chance to expand into the empty spaces. In that sense, these pioneers were not rulers but seeds. Their fragility was balanced by their potential, and that potential would change the course of Earth's history. It's tempting to imagine them in motion. A small group of Eoraptor darting through the ferns at dawn, their movements quick and restless as they hunt insects. A Herrerasaurus breaking into a sprint, claws outstretched as it lunges at prey in the half-light of evening. A herd of Coelophysis scattering across a floodplain, their tails balancing their bodies as they dash away from sudden danger. These scenes remind us that these were not just names or bones in stone. They were living, breathing creatures, each step a gamble, each day a test of survival. Their success or failure was measured not in destiny, but in whether they saw another sunrise. And yet, from those fragile steps came the first stirrings of dominance. They were pioneers not because they ruled their world, but because they carried forward ideas that others did not. Upright posture, stamina, versatility, group living. These were the experiments that survived catastrophe, the traits that proved useful when climates shifted and ecosystems collapsed. They did not know it, could not know it, but in their small lives lay the beginnings of an empire that would one day reshape the Earth. The pioneers of the Triassic deserve our attention, not only because of what they became, but because of what they were in their own time, survivors in a harsh and unpredictable world. They remind us that dynasties often begin not with thunder but with whispers, not with giants but with small creatures finding ways to endure. The Triassic was filled with countless experiments in life, but among them, a few fragile footsteps pointed toward the future. And those footsteps, pressed into mud millions of years ago, still echo in the stones we uncover today. When we look back on the age of dinosaurs, it feels inevitable that they became the rulers of the Earth. Their bodies seem designed for dominance, tall, fast, strong, adaptable. But the truth of the Triassic is far less certain. For millions of years, dinosaurs were not the most obvious candidates for supremacy. They were small, sometimes rare, and often overshadowed. Their real competition came not from the mammal-like synapsids, which had been reduced to small survivors after the Permian extinction, but from another branch of reptiles, the crurotarsans, distant cousins of crocodiles. These animals were diverse, successful, and for much of the Triassic they looked every bit as likely, if not more so, to inherit the world. In another roll of the evolutionary dice, it might have been crocodile kin, not dinosaurs, that rose to power. The crurotarsans were not the crocodiles we know today. Modern crocs are semi-aquatic ambush hunters, built for lurking in rivers with patience and explosive power. Their Triassic relatives were far more varied. Some looked like armoured tanks, slow-moving plant eaters that grazed on low vegetation. Others grew long legs and walked upright, sprinting across floodplains in pursuit of prey. Some were predators with skulls shaped like those of meat-slicing dinosaurs, lined with serrated teeth. They filled the same roles that dinosaurs would later dominate, and in many ecosystems of the late Triassic, they were the ones in charge. Take Postosuchus, for example. This massive predator, reaching lengths of 5 to 6 meters, walked on 4 legs but could rear up on 2 when needed. Its body was muscular, its jaws filled with sharp teeth, its head heavy and powerful. Fossils show evidence of bony armour along its back, giving it protection as well as strength. Postosuchus was one of the apex predators of its time, hunting early dinosaurs and other reptiles with ease. In regions of North America, where its fossils are found, it was dinosaurs that lived in the shadows of such giants, not the other way around. Other crurotarsans were herbivores, like the etosaurs. These were heavily armoured reptiles, their bodies covered in rows of bony plates, some even decorated with ridges and spikes. They shuffled through conifer forests and across river valleys, rooting up plants with pig-like snouts. Their armour made them difficult prey for predators, and in many places they were among the most common herbivores of their ecosystems. Dinosaurs were present, but it was these armoured cousins of crocodiles that formed the backbone of plant-eating life. Then there were the Rauisuchians, a group of large, upright walking predators that truly resembled dinosaurs in appearance. Their legs were positioned directly under their bodies, their stride efficient, their speed impressive. In fact, if you were to see one in life, you might mistake it for a theropod dinosaur. This similarity is no coincidence. Both groups evolved similar solutions to the same challenges of hunting in open landscapes. But in the Triassic, Rauisuchians often held the upper hand. They were bigger, more common, and firmly entrenched at the top of the food chain. The sheer diversity of these crurotarsans is what makes them so striking. In one lineage you see predators capable of challenging any rival. In another, you see bulky armoured grazers. In yet another, you find semi-aquatic hunters lurking in rivers. They spread across Pangaea, adapting to deserts, forests, floodplains, and coasts. Dinosaurs were only one set of players among many, and there was little reason at the time to predict they would outlast their crocodilian cousins. What ultimately tipped the balance was not superiority in battle, but the shifting hand of the environment. The late Triassic was a time of upheaval. Volcanic eruptions shook the continents as Pangaea began to rift apart. Lava flowed across vast regions, gases altered the climate, and ecosystems collapsed under the stress. This was the end-Triassic extinction, one of the great turning points in life's history. Many groups perished, including a huge portion of the crurotarsans. Their diversity, once their strength, could not save them when whole habitats vanished. Dinosaurs, with their efficient lungs, light skeletons, and adaptable diets, managed to survive the crisis. When the dust cleared, it was the crocodile relatives that had shrunk to minor roles, and the dinosaurs that expanded into the empty spaces. But imagining what might have been is a useful exercise. If the crurotarsans had weathered the end-Triassic extinction better, perhaps they would have become the dominant reptiles of the Mesozoic. Instead of herds of sauropods crossing Jurassic plains, we might picture herds of armoured etosaurs. Instead of tyrannosaurs, we might imagine massive Rauisuchians with crocodile ancestry dominating as apex predators. Instead of feathered raptors, perhaps it would have been agile, bipedal crocodile cousins that developed similar traits. Evolution had multiple candidates for empire, and dinosaurs were only one of them. Evidence of their competition shows up in the fossil record. In the same rock layers, we find dinosaur bones alongside those of Rauisuchians and etosaurs. We find bite marks that may have been left by Postosuchus jaws. We find trackways where the footprints of dinosaurs cross paths with those of their rivals. For millions of years, they shared the same landscapes, not as ruler and subject, but as equals, each group testing strategies for survival. It was not inevitable that one would replace the other. It was a contest shaped by chance, by climate, by extinction. Even today, crocodiles carry the legacy of this lost potential. They are the last surviving crurotarsans, reduced from a dynasty of variety to a narrow set of semi-aquatic hunters. Yet their endurance is remarkable. They survived not only the end-Triassic extinction, but also the asteroid that wiped out most dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous. Their story is not one of failure but of persistence. They could have been kings, and in another world they might have been, but in our own, they became survivors, holding on to rivers and swamps as their thrones. For dinosaurs, the competition with these crocodile kin was both a challenge and a proving ground. It forced them to refine their bodies, to sharpen their adaptations, to become better at what they did. When extinction swept their rivals aside, they were ready to expand. Their dynasty was not born in isolation but in rivalry, tested against predators and herbivores that could easily have taken their place. The triumph of dinosaurs was not destiny. It was survival through chance and readiness, the narrow victory of one branch of reptiles over another equally capable branch. The Triassic, then, is not just the story of beginnings, but of possibilities. Dinosaurs did not simply rise. They rose because others fell. The crocodile cousins, with all their diversity, with all their potential, remind us that history could have turned out differently. The kings of the Mesozoic might have looked nothing like the creatures we know so well, but fate chose differently, and the dynasty that seemed fragile became the one that defined an age. In every age of life on Earth, survival has been a conversation between predator and prey. One cannot be understood without the other, because each defines the other's limits. A predator's teeth sharpen in response to the defences of its prey, and the prey's armour or speed grows in answer to the threat that hunts it. The Triassic was no exception. In fact, because it was a time of recovery and experimentation, the balance of power between predator and prey was more fluid, more uncertain than in almost any later period. It was a world where roles were not yet fixed, where giants and small survivors shared the same landscapes, and where every adaptation could mean the difference between dominance and extinction. The Triassic began with emptiness. After the devastation of the Permian extinction, most ecosystems had collapsed. Food chains were shattered. Predators had no prey. Prey had no safe places to graze. Slowly, as plants regrew and insects repopulated, herbivores returned, and with them came the predators that depended on them. The earliest herbivores of the Triassic were often reptiles experimenting with new designs, armoured etosaurs rooting through soil, early sauropodomorphs nibbling on conifers, dicynodonts surviving a little longer in some corners. Each of these plant-eaters carried defences of its own: armour, bulk, or the safety of herds. Predators adapted in response, testing speed, stealth, or brute force. Postosuchus and other Rauisuchians stand out as examples of apex predators during this time. Their bodies were built for power. Strong legs positioned under the body gave them endurance and speed. Heavy skulls and serrated teeth gave them the tools to bring down large prey. In the Triassic floodplains of what is now North America, a Postosuchus could dominate its ecosystem, hunting early dinosaurs and herbivorous reptiles alike. To smaller creatures like Coelophysis or the young of Plateosaurus, the shadow of such a predator was constant. Yet predators did not always have the upper hand. Herbivores had strategies of their own, and in many cases those strategies were just as successful. The etosaurs, for instance, were not fast, but their thick armour made them difficult to attack. Predators risked injury when biting into their plates. Plateosaurus and other early sauropodomorphs, while not heavily armoured, used size and herding as defence. A single individual might be vulnerable, but in groups they could keep watch, and their sheer mass made them less appealing targets. For smaller prey animals, speed and stealth were the answers. Eoraptor and similar creatures survived by darting through undergrowth, staying unseen, and fleeing at the first sign of danger. The balance of power extended into the water as well. Temnospondyle amphibians lurked in rivers and lakes, their broad heads snapping up fish or small reptiles. Early ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs patrolled the seas, preying on ammonites, fish, and each other. The oceans, like the land, were arenas of constant adjustment. Ammonites grew shells with increasingly complex patterns of chambers, which may have strengthened them against pressure and predation. Fish evolved faster swimming styles to escape the reptiles that hunted them. Each advance by one group provoked an answer from another, weaving the intricate web of predator-prey relationships that held the ecosystems together. Even insects and amphibians played their part in this balance. Swarms of insects provided food for amphibians and small reptiles, which in turn became prey for larger predators. Frogs and salamander-like creatures snapped at beetles and dragonflies, while themselves being eaten by Calophysis or by fish. No part of the web existed in isolation. The smallest buzz of wings could ripple upward to affect the largest hunters. A drought that killed plants would starve insects, which would reduce amphibian populations, which would in turn deprive larger predators of prey. The balance was delicate, constantly tested, and always on the edge of collapse. What is striking about the Triassic is how evenly matched many of these relationships were. Later in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, dinosaurs would rise to such dominance that they seemed to overwhelm their ecosystems, their sheer size and numbers giving them a kind of monopoly. But in the Triassic, power was contested. Crustaceans held dominance in some places, dinosaurs in others. Herbivores tried out multiple strategies: armour, size, speed to stay alive. Predators ranged from ambushers in rivers to sprinters on the plains. No single group had yet taken permanent control. It was an age of experimentation in the arms race between hunter and hunted. The fossil record preserves glimpses of these struggles. In some sites, the remains of Calophysis are found alongside those of Postosuchus, hinting at the predator-prey dynamics of their world. Tooth marks on bones show where carnivores fed, sometimes even gnawing the remains of their own kind. In coprolites, we find fragments of plants, fish scales, and bone, each a record of a meal consumed millions of years ago. Trackways in mud show herds moving together, sometimes pursued by parallel predator tracks. Each fossil is a fragment of the drama that played out daily across Triassic landscapes, and yet balance was not only about violence, it was also about restraint. A predator that hunted too efficiently risked wiping out its prey and starving itself. A prey animal that reproduced too quickly risked overgrazing its environment and collapsing its own food source. The Triassic ecosystems, fragile as they were, found equilibrium in this tension. Populations rose and fell with the seasons, predators thinned out herds, herbivores rebounded with the rains, and insects filled gaps with their abundance. It was never static, but it was sustainable enough to last tens of millions of years. For the early dinosaurs, this balance was both a challenge and an opportunity. They were not yet apex predators, but their speed and stamina allowed them to hunt smaller prey effectively. They were not the dominant herbivores, but their versatility let them nibble plants others ignored. Their role in the predator-prey dynamic was modest, but it gave them practice. When the end-Triassic extinction disrupted these balances and removed many of their rivals, they were ready to expand into roles they had long been testing in small ways. The balance of predator and prey in the Triassic reminds us of how ecosystems truly work. It is not simply about who is strongest or who dominates. It is about relationships, about constant feedback loops where each side shapes the other. Predators sharpen their teeth, prey thickens its armour, herbivores grow larger, predators grow faster, insects swarm, amphibians flourish, reptiles adapt. No victory is permanent, no adaptation final. The game resets with every drought, every flood, every eruption. And in the Triassic, that game was still wide open. To walk through a Triassic valley would have been to witness this balance firsthand. Herds of armoured etosaurs shuffle through cycads, watched by Rauisuchians hidden in the trees. A Calophysis darts after a dragonfly, only to vanish as a larger predator lunges from the shadows. In the river nearby, a temnospondyle snaps at fish, while nothosaurs patrol the shallows. Everywhere you look, there is tension, the constant push and pull of survival. And yet, despite the violence, there is also harmony. The system works, precarious though it is, each creature shaping and being shaped by the others. The Triassic was not yet the age of dinosaurs, but it was the crucible in which their dynasty was forged. Their rivals were powerful, their prey elusive, their environment unforgiving. To survive here was to learn balance, how to take without exhausting, how to run without tiring, how to adapt without breaking. Predator and prey together built the world that would carry forward into the Jurassic, a world where dinosaurs would finally step into the roles they had been rehearsing. When we talk about the Triassic, we can't separate the animals and plants from the stage they lived on, and in that age, the stage was unlike anything we know today. Instead of scattered continents, separated by oceans and shaped into the familiar outlines we learn from maps, nearly all of Earth's land was gathered into a single vast supercontinent. Pangaea stretched across the globe from north to south, an unbroken expanse of rock and soil that created a horizon seemingly without end. To walk it would have been to cross deserts larger than any we can imagine now, forests that seem to go on forever, and mountain chains that cut across entire regions without interruption. It was a world defined not just by its creatures, but by its sheer scale. The immensity of Pangaea shaped everything. Its sheer size created climates far more extreme than we're used to today. Along the coasts, where seas could moderate temperatures and bring rain, life was relatively lush. Rivers meandered into wide floodplains, plants grew in abundance, and animals had food and water enough to sustain them. But in the interior, hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from the sea, the story was different. There, rain rarely fell, and when it did, it often came in brief, violent bursts. The summers were blisteringly hot, the winters bitterly cold. Deserts stretched in endless waves of red sand, punctuated only by the occasional river valley or oasis, where life could cling to existence. This contrast between coast and interior gave the Triassic world its character. Along the margins of Pangaea, where green shores hugged warm oceans, ecosystems flourished with relative stability. Forests of conifers, cycads, and ginkgos shaded the ground, and rivers supported amphibians, reptiles, and insects. Here, herds of herbivores could find food, and predators followed in their wake. Inland, however, survival was far more precarious. There, only the hardiest plants grew, scrappy conifers with needle-like leaves, tough cycads, and carpets of ferns clinging to the rare patches of moisture. Animals had to travel long distances to find food and water, and the open deserts left them exposed to predators and the elements alike. The endless horizon of Pangaea also meant that animals could spread widely. There were few barriers, no oceans cutting off migration routes, no continents isolating populations. A dinosaur that evolved in what is now Argentina could, over time or over generations, spread north into what is now North America or east into Africa without crossing a sea. This connectivity allowed for rapid dispersal of species, which is why we find some of the same kinds of Triassic animals in fossil beds separated today by entire oceans. The world was open, its paths unbroken, its horizons seemingly infinite. But this openness also came with instability. Without oceans breaking up the land, weather patterns grew harsher. Monsoons swept across vast regions, bringing floods that turned valleys into temporary wetlands. Then the rains would vanish, leaving behind cracked earth and parched vegetation. For animals, this meant constant adaptation. Herbivores had to move with the seasons, following the growth of plants. Predators had to follow the herds, or risk starvation. Small creatures, from insects to early mammals, relied on burrows and shelters to ride out the extremes. No one could stay still for long, because Pangaea's climate was never gentle for long. Mountains cut through parts of this vast continent, remnants of earlier collisions that had brought the land masses together. These ranges influenced rainfall, creating rain shadows and dry basins. Rivers carved their way through valleys, offering lifelines of green in otherwise barren expanses. Along these rivers, forests grew thicker and life gathered. Fossil evidence often comes from these ancient riverbeds, where floods buried bones and preserved the traces of creatures long gone. It is in places like these that we find the remains of Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus, and Coelophysis, early pioneers whose fragile steps were pressed into the mud of floodplains. The The sheer scale of Pangaea also created opportunities for giants. With so much open land, there was space for large herbivores to roam, for predators to chase them across vast plains. Plateosaurus, one of the earliest large dinosaurs, grew to lengths of 9 meters and could range widely across the continent. Armored etosaurs shuffled in herds through conifer forests, their heavy bodies safe from many predators. And above all of this, the open landscapes favoured animals that could move efficiently. Upright posture, stamina and endurance became decisive traits, and it is no coincidence that dinosaurs, with their straight legs and efficient breathing, thrived in this environment. But the endless horizon of Pangaea was not just a blessing, it carried within it the seeds of destruction. The landmass was restless, its tectonic plates pulling and grinding beneath the surface. Volcanoes erupted across rift valleys, sending lava and gases into the air. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest volcanic systems in Earth's history, would eventually erupt at the end of the Triassic, unleashing enough basalt to cover millions of square kilometres. The gases from these eruptions altered the climate, contributing to the extinction that cleared the stage for dinosaurs to expand fully. Pangaea's vastness gave life its space, but it also made it vulnerable to catastrophe on a scale no smaller continent could endure. To stand on Pangaea would have been to feel both awe and unease. The horizon stretched farther than the eye could see, the land unbroken except by the shimmer of distant heat or the dark line of a conifer forest. Herds moved slowly across open plains, their silhouettes small against the immensity of the land. Predators prowled the edges, their movements dwarfed by the space around them. Overhead, the sun beat down without mercy, and when storms came, they swept across the land with a ferocity amplified by the openness of the continent. It was a stage both grand and unforgiving, one that shaped every creature that lived upon it. For paleontologists, the fossils of Pangaea tell this story not just in bones but in the rocks themselves. The red beds of Triassic formations, coloured by iron oxides, speak of deserts and arid climates. Ripple marks and mud cracks tell of rivers that rose and fell, lakes that dried, and valleys that alternated between flood and drought. Ash layers remind us of the constant presence of volcanoes. Each stratum is a page in the record of a supercontinent's life, capturing the extremes that defined it. The endless horizon of Pangaea gave the Triassic its scale and its character. It connected ecosystems, it tested resilience, and it amplified both opportunity and danger. Dinosaurs began their dynasty here, in this vast and open world, where survival meant endurance and adaptability. Their rivals, the crocodile kin, also thrived here, spreading across the same plains and forests. Small mammals and amphibians found niches where they could, often in the margins of rivers or the shelter of forests. Insects filled the air, linking it all together. Every creature, large or small, was shaped by the immensity of the land beneath them, and yet, for all its power and reach, Pangaea was not permanent. Its endless horizon would eventually fracture, splitting into continents that drifted toward the shapes we know today. But in the Triassic, it was whole, and that wholeness gave rise to both fragility and resilience. The creatures that lived on it were tested by its extremes, forged by its size, and carried forward by the opportunities it provided. To understand the Triassic is to understand Pangaea, because without that supercontinent's vastness, the story of life in this age would have been entirely different. The Triassic was not only a story of animals finding their place, or plants pushing back across landscapes left barren by extinction. It was also a story of Earth itself in motion, restless and unpredictable. Beneath the soils where cycads took root, and above the floodplains where early dinosaurs left their tracks, forces far greater were at work. Volcanoes thundered, continents strained against each other, and the atmosphere itself shifted with gases and ash. To live in the Triassic was to live at the mercy of a planet that was rebuilding and remaking itself constantly, sometimes slowly, sometimes with explosive violence. Volcanoes had always been part of Earth's story, but in the Triassic they were both destroyers and creators. Across Pangaea, rift valleys were opening, places where the immense supercontinent was beginning to stretch and crack. These were the first hints that one day Pangaea would break apart. But in the Triassic, it was still whole, the cracks running like silent warnings through its surface. Along these rifts, volcanoes erupted, sometimes quietly, spilling lava that cooled into vast basalt plains, and sometimes catastrophically, sending ash clouds into the sky and choking whole regions in poisonous gases. For the animals and plants that live nearby, these events could mean sudden death. For the atmosphere, they meant long-term change. The gases released during these eruptions, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane from destabilized deposits, reshaped climates. Carbon dioxide trapped heat, warming the planet. Sulfur dioxide reflected sunlight, cooling the surface temporarily, but also acidifying rain when it returned. These fluctuations created climates that could swing between extremes, leaving ecosystems constantly off balance. A forest might flourish for centuries under relatively stable conditions, only to collapse when drought stretched longer, or when cooling from volcanic ash lasted too many seasons. Insects, amphibians, and reptiles had to endure these swings or perish. Those that survived were those that could adapt quickly, burrowing underground, migrating with the seasons, or reproducing in bursts during favourable years. The atmosphere itself was unsettled. Without modern patterns of ocean currents and without continents in the positions we know today, winds carried moisture unevenly. Monsoons lashed the edges of Pangaea, drenching coastal regions, while the interior often baked in drought. In one place, rivers overflowed with floods, leaving behind fertile soil but also sweeping away herds of animals. In another, sand dunes marched across the land, covering everything in their path. This uneven distribution of climate made life patchy, with oases of abundance separated by seas of scarcity. Animals had to move constantly, following rains and growth. For predators, this meant long migrations. For prey, it meant constant vigilance. The record of these changes is written into the rocks. Layers of ash capture volcanic outbursts, frozen in time as pale bands amid the red sediments of Triassic deserts. Chemical traces in ancient soils reveal spikes of carbon dioxide, sudden shifts in temperature. Fossil forests preserved in volcanic mudflows show us stands of trees that grew for centuries before being buried in an instant. Each of these clues tells of a restless world, a place where stability was rare and the ground itself could not be trusted. And yet volcanoes were not only destructive, they also enriched the earth. Lava, once cooled, created fertile soils, rich in minerals that plants could use. Ash layers could seed new growth once the danger had passed, feeding forests for generations. The same forces that brought death also laid the groundwork for renewal. Life in the Triassic was shaped by this duality, destroyed by eruptions but also nourished by the lands they left behind. In many ways, it was a world constantly in flux, never fully stable, but always regenerating. For animals like the early dinosaurs, this restlessness may have been an advantage. Small, lightly built and adaptable, they could move into new environments quickly. When volcanoes destroyed one habitat, they could disperse to another. When climates shifted, their stamina and upright posture allowed them to migrate long distances. Their rivals, often larger and more specialized crocodile kin, might not have been as flexible. This difference may help explain why dinosaurs ultimately survived the end-Triassic extinction, when massive volcanic eruptions created some of the most dramatic climate upheavals in Earth's history. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a vast volcanic system, was the ultimate expression of this restlessness. At the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic, it erupted on a scale almost unimaginable today. Lava flows stretched for thousands of kilometers, gases filled the air for centuries, temperatures rose, ocean chemistry shifted, ecosystems collapsed, entire groups of reptiles vanished, and yet dinosaurs passed through, scarred but alive, ready to expand into the spaces that had been emptied. This was the defining moment of their rise, and it was born not from triumph in battle, but from survival in the face of planetary upheaval. The atmosphere itself during the Triassic was not the same as ours. Oxygen levels were lower, closer to 15 to 17% compared to today's 21%. This made life harder for animals that relied on deep breaths for stamina. Insects, which had reached giant sizes in earlier periods when oxygen was higher, were more modest in the Triassic. Animals needed efficient respiratory systems to thrive, and this may have given dinosaurs another edge. With their possible air sacs and bird-like breathing, they could handle low oxygen better than many competitors. Mammal ancestors, with high metabolic rates and possibly early forms of warm-bloodedness, also found ways to cope. In contrast, some reptiles with less efficient systems struggled in this thinner air. This restless atmosphere was part of the background music of the Triassic. Every breath, every shift of the wind, every storm carried traces of the planet's instability. The creatures that lived then did not know why the rains failed, or why the air seemed harder to breathe. They simply lived with the consequences. Some adapted and survived. Others fell away. Over millions of years, the balance tilted slowly toward the lineages that could handle a restless Earth. To imagine this world is to imagine a sky streaked with ash plumes, a horizon sometimes red with sunsets intensified by volcanic dust, sometimes dimmed by veils of sulfur clouds. It is to picture floodplains one year covered in green, the next year cracked and barren under relentless heat. It is to hear the crack of distant eruptions echo across valleys, the hiss of lava as it met rivers and forests, the silence that followed when animals fled or died, and it is to remember that through it all life persisted, shaping itself to a planet that offered no guarantees. The Triassic was not a calm prelude to the age of dinosaurs. It was a crucible, a world forged in extremes, where volcanoes wrote the rules and the atmosphere shifted constantly. Out of that restlessness came resilience. The survivors of the Triassic, dinosaurs, mammals, crocodiles, amphibians, insects, were those who could bend without breaking, who could live in a world where the ground shook, the sky darkened, and the air itself was never the same for long. Extinctions are the punctuation marks of Earth's history, sudden interruptions that shift the story in new directions. Some are small, trimming branches without reshaping the whole tree. Others are so massive that they topple entire forests of life, leaving behind bare ground for something new to take root. The end of the Triassic was one of those great upheavals. For tens of millions of years, life had been rebuilding from the devastation of the Permian. Forests stretched again across the land, rivers filled with amphibians and fish, reptiles of every shape and size tested the limits of evolution. Dinosaurs were there, but they were minor players, sharing their stage with armoured herbivores, crocodile cousins, and amphibian giants. Then the skies darkened, the ground split open, and the balance of power shifted forever. The cause of this extinction lies deep within Earth's crust. As Pangaea began to fracture, enormous volcanic systems opened along the seams of the supercontinent. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest volcanic provinces in Earth's history, erupted over what is now eastern North America, northwestern Africa, and parts of South America and Europe. For hundreds of thousands of years, lava spilled across the land in sheets that hardened into basalt, covering millions of square kilometres. These were not small eruptions. They were continent-spanning events, repeated in pulses, each lasting long enough to overwhelm ecosystems and alter the climate. The skies filled with gases. Carbon dioxide poured out in staggering amounts, trapping heat and pushing the planet toward rapid warming. At the same time, sulfur dioxide and ash clouds created short-term cooling, dimming sunlight and disrupting photosynthesis. The combination of warming, cooling, acid rain, and ocean changes created chaos. Plants withered under droughts and toxic rains. Animals struggled as food chains collapsed. In the oceans, carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater, lowering its pH and stressing marine life. Ammonites, corals, and many marine reptiles suffered as chemistry shifted faster than they could adapt. On land, the devastation was just as profound. Many groups that had thrived throughout the Triassic suddenly disappeared. The Crurotarsans, those crocodile relatives that had seemed poised for dominance, lost much of their diversity. The Rauisuchians, large predators that rivaled dinosaurs, vanished entirely. The armadillosaurs, once common herbivores, also faded into extinction. Even some amphibians and smaller reptile lineages could not survive the upheaval. In the space of a geological instant, the cast of the Triassic was cut down, leaving open niches across the supercontinent. The fossil record shows this shift clearly. In Triassic rocks, the diversity of reptile groups is broad, with dinosaurs present but limited. Then, across the boundary into the Jurassic, many of those groups vanish and dinosaurs begin to multiply. Their footprints appear in greater abundance, their fossils in greater variety. What had been small, fragile populations suddenly expanded into dominance. It was not that they had overpowered their rivals in direct competition, but that the extinction had cleared the board, leaving them the survivors in a world with fewer players. Why did dinosaurs survive when others fell? Part of the answer may lie in their physiology. Their upright stance and efficient lungs gave them stamina and endurance, allowing them to cope with long migrations during climate swings. Their possible warm-bloodedness or near-warm-blooded metabolism may have allowed them to remain active in cooler or more variable conditions. Their diversity of diets, herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores alike, gave them flexibility, and their small size at the beginning may have been a hidden advantage, letting them reproduce quickly and rebound faster than bulkier, slower rivals. Survival in an extinction is not always about being strongest. It is often about being most adaptable, most ready for instability. The extinction was global, but its impact varied by region. In some places, ecosystems collapsed almost entirely, leaving behind barren landscapes where only hardy plants and small animals endured. In others, pockets of life clung on, sheltered by geography or luck. These refuges became the seeds for recovery, places where survivors could rebuild when conditions stabilized. Dinosaurs were among those survivors, and from these scattered remnants they began to spread into dominance. For the creatures living through it, the end-Triassic extinction would not have been a single dramatic event but a series of crises. One year might bring floods and cooling from ash clouds. The next century might bring relentless heat and drought. Animals adapted to one swing might be caught off guard by the next. Over thousands of years, populations dwindled, food chains unraveled, and once dominant groups slipped into oblivion. The skies darkened again and again, not for days but for generations, until the balance of life was altered beyond recognition. The aftermath was a different world. In the early Jurassic, landscapes once filled with a mix of crocodile kin, amphibians and small dinosaurs now leaned heavily toward dinosaurs. Sauropodomorphs, the ancestors of giants, began to expand into new roles as dominant herbivores. Theropods grew larger and more diverse, filling predator niches left vacant by the extinction of Rauisuchians. Small mammals, still insignificant in size, endured in the shadows, waiting for their turn in a much later age. Crocodile relatives survived too, but in reduced forms, confined mostly to semi-aquatic lifestyles rather than the sweeping diversity they once enjoyed. The balance of power had shifted, and the dynasty of dinosaurs had truly begun. Extinctions like this remind us how fragile dominance can be. For much of the Triassic, it was not clear who would rise. Crurotarsans seemed every bit as capable as dinosaurs. Amphibians still clung to their rivers, and small synapsids carried the seeds of mammals. Then the Earth itself intervened, tilting the scales. The skies darkened, the atmosphere grew restless, and in the aftermath, only a few lineages carried forward. Dinosaurs were among them, and that survival turned them from one group among many into the defining figures of the Mesozoic. To imagine the end-Triassic extinction is to imagine a world of unease, the air thick with haze, the horizon glowing with distant lava flows, rivers running dark with ash, forests withering under acidic rains, herds of herbivores thinning year by year, predators pacing wider ranges in search of food, amphibians disappearing from ponds that dried or turned toxic. It was not a single catastrophe, but a grinding attrition, a long twilight that stretched across millennia. And then, slowly, when the eruptions eased and the skies cleared, new green began to spread again. But the creatures that returned were not the same as those that had gone. The torch had passed. The end of the Triassic was the dawn of the dinosaurs, not because they conquered their world in battle, but because they were left standing when so many others had fallen. Their dynasty began in the shadow of catastrophe, a reminder that survival is as much about chance and resilience as it is about strength. When the skies darkened, many lineages vanished. But the dinosaurs endured, and from that endurance came an empire that would last for the next 135 million years. When we look back at the Triassic, the temptation is to skip ahead, to see it only as a prelude to the Jurassic, where dinosaurs truly begin to dominate. But the truth is, the Triassic is the hinge where everything turns. It's the place where survival, fragile and uncertain, transforms into supremacy. Dinosaurs were not destined to rule the Earth. They were small, scattered, and surrounded by rivals that seemed better equipped to take over. Yet when disaster struck at the end of the Triassic, dinosaurs did not just endure, they emerged as the central survivors. That survival set the stage for everything that followed, and in the space of a geological moment, their quiet persistence became the foundation of an empire. Survival, at its core, is not glamorous. It's about making it through lean years, hiding in the shadows, eating whatever is available, and reproducing fast enough to stay ahead of extinction. For much of the Triassic, that is what dinosaurs were doing. Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus, Chilophysis, these were not rulers, they were strivers. They darted after insects, nibbled on ferns, scavenged when they could, and lived alongside predators that could easily have crushed them. They found ways to stay alive without outshining their competitors. The fact that they managed to persist in such a crowded world was itself remarkable. The key was adaptability. Early dinosaurs were generalists. Some, like Eoraptor, could eat both plants and meat, making them less vulnerable to sudden shortages. Others, like Chilophysis, lived in groups, which gave them safety in numbers and perhaps hunting advantages. Their bodies were light, their postures upright, their movements efficient. They did not need to be the largest or the strongest. They needed only to stay nimble, to take advantage of whatever scraps the world offered. In times of stability, this kept them in the background, but in times of crisis, it gave them the flexibility to endure. When the end-Triassic extinction struck, that flexibility became decisive. Many of their rivals were specialists. Etosaurs relied on particular kinds of vegetation. Rauisuchians filled roles as apex predators, dependent on a steady supply of large prey. When climates swung wildly, when vegetation collapsed, when prey vanished, specialists starved. Dinosaurs, with their mixed diets, efficient bodies, and rapid reproduction, weathered the storm more easily. They didn't escape unscathed. Many species disappeared, but as a group, they held on. And when the extinction ended, they were left standing in landscapes suddenly emptied of competitors. This was the turning point. For tens of millions of years, dinosaurs had been minor figures, overshadowed by crocodile cousins and amphibian giants. Now, almost overnight in geological terms, they were in a world that belonged to them. The extinction had cleared away much of the competition, and dinosaurs expanded into the empty niches. Small herbivores became larger, testing new body plans that would lead to the first true giants. Carnivores diversified, growing stronger and more numerous as they hunted the new herds of plant-eaters. What had been survival strategies became the building blocks of supremacy. The fossil record after the extinction captures this transformation. In early Jurassic rocks, dinosaur footprints multiply, spreading across floodplains where once they were rare. Fossils of sauropodomorphs show their bodies lengthening, their necks stretching higher to reach food others could not. Theropods become more varied, from small hunters to larger, more formidable predators. Within a few million years, dinosaurs are no longer background players. They are the framework of entire ecosystems. Their supremacy is not a gradual rise through competition, but a sudden expansion fueled by opportunity. This shift was not only about the disappearance of rivals, but also about the endurance of traits already present. Dinosaurs had always carried the potential for dominance in their upright stance, efficient lungs, and versatile diets. The extinction simply removed the barriers that had kept that potential from flourishing. In that sense, supremacy was not something they achieved after the extinction. It was something they were already equipped for, waiting for the chance to express it. Survival was the test. Supremacy was the reward. It's important to see how fragile this path was. Had the end-Triassic extinction not occurred, it's entirely possible dinosaurs would have remained small and scattered. Crurotasans might have continued as the dominant predators and herbivores. Amphibians might have held on longer in their rivers and lakes. Mammal ancestors might have expanded earlier. The world we imagine as the age of dinosaurs could easily have been an age of crocodile kin. History is not destiny. It is chance shaped by readiness. Dinosaurs were ready, and chance favoured them. Supremacy also reshaped them in return. As they spread into open niches, natural selection pushed them into new forms. Some became giants, like Plateosaurus and its descendants, filling landscapes with herds of massive plant-eaters. Others became specialised predators, honing their claws and teeth for hunting larger prey. Still others remained small and agile, filling the roles of insect eaters, scavengers, and opportunists. Supremacy did not mean uniformity. It meant variety. The dynasty of dinosaurs was built on diversification, each branch exploring a different way of being. The climate of the early Jurassic, though still unstable, offered enough stability for this diversification. Rain fell more reliably along coasts, forests grew thicker, and ecosystems became richer. Dinosaurs were poised to take advantage of every layer, from the canopy to the ground, from riversides to deserts. Their supremacy was not simply that they were numerous, but that they were everywhere, shaping every part of the food web. The chorus of insects still hummed, amphibians still croaked, mammals still scurried, but the stage now belonged to dinosaurs. From this perspective, the supremacy of dinosaurs was not about strength alone. It was about persistence, patience, and timing. They did not win the Triassic by overpowering their rivals. They won it by enduring long enough to inherit a world reshaped by catastrophe. Their dynasty grew not from conquest, but from resilience. They remind us that in evolution, survival and supremacy are not separate stages, but part of the same continuum. To survive is to keep the possibility of supremacy alive. To reach supremacy is to prove that survival was more than chance, it was preparation. And so the story of the Triassic ends not with a world fading into darkness, but with a world beginning again. The skies cleared after the great eruptions, the air warmed, plants spread and animals returned. But the faces of those animals were different. Where once Rausuchians stalked and Etosaurs grazed, dinosaurs now filled the roles. Their survival had carried them through the crucible, and their supremacy would define the ages to come. From fragile beginnings to global rulers, the path was uncertain, but the outcome reshaped Earth for the next 135 million years. The story of dinosaurs is often told as though they exploded onto the scene. towering and terrifying from the very start. But the truth is gentler and stranger. For tens of millions of years in the Triassic, they lived in the shadows, small and often overlooked, fragile against predators that outmatched them and herbivores that outweighed them. They were not kings of their world, but survivors clinging to the edges of ecosystems already crowded with competitors. Then, almost suddenly, the scales tipped. What had once been whispers on the landscape grew into the loudest voices. Dinosaurs stepped out from obscurity into dominance, and their takeover reshaped life on Earth for more than 100 million years. To understand this takeover, it helps to remember where they began. Early dinosaurs like Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus were modest creatures, their bodies lightweight, their diets opportunistic. They were not apex predators, nor were they the largest herbivores. They survived by speed, by versatility, by keeping out of the way of the giants around them. Crurotarsans, the crocodile cousins of the Triassic, ruled many ecosystems, from armoured plant-eaters to sleek hunters. Amphibians still lingered in rivers, some large enough to swallow small reptiles whole. Mammal ancestors scratched out lives in the shadows. In this crowded cast, dinosaurs were only one small troop, trying to find a place to perform. For millions of years, that is where they stayed. Minor, persistent, but not dominant. Their skeletons in Triassic rock are sparse compared to those of their rivals. Their footprints are scattered, sometimes present but never overwhelming. If you lived in the Triassic and walked across a floodplain, you might never even notice a dinosaur. You would see armoured etosaurs shuffling through cycads, rowisuchians lurking with crocodile jaws, and amphibians breaking the water's surface. Dinosaurs were there, but they were not the stars. Then came the end-Triassic extinction, and the stage changed overnight in geological terms. The eruptions of the Central Atlantic magmatic province darkened skies and poisoned air. Ecosystems that had been stable collapsed under the pressure of climate swings. Herbivores that had fed steadily for millions of years starved when vegetation faltered. Predators that relied on those herds starved in turn. Amphibians, already struggling with the drying of Pangaea's interior, declined further. Entire groups of reptiles disappeared, their lineages ending in the ash of volcanic outbursts. The balance of power was erased, and into that void stepped the dinosaurs. The takeover did not look like a battle. There were no armies of dinosaurs sweeping across landscapes to overthrow their rivals. Instead, it was an expansion, quiet and steady as they filled the spaces left behind. Sauropodomorphs, once modest plant-eaters, grew larger, experimenting with longer necks and heavier bodies, feeding on conifers that others could no longer reach. Theropods diversified, some remaining small hunters of insects and lizards, others becoming larger predators to replace the vanished rowisuchians. Even within a few million years, dinosaurs were no longer scattered. They were the backbone of ecosystems, their presence impossible to overlook. Fossil evidence captures this transformation with startling clarity. In Triassic rocks, dinosaur bones and tracks are rare, surrounded by the remains of crocodile kin. In Jurassic rocks just above them, the picture reverses. Suddenly, dinosaur tracks crisscross ancient floodplains, and their bones appear in abundance. Sauropodomorphs dominate as herbivores, theropods as predators. Dinosaurs are no longer shadows, they are the structure around which ecosystems revolve. Their takeover is written in stone, not as a slow trickle but as a sudden surge. The traits that had once kept them alive in the shadows became the keys to their supremacy. Their upright posture allowed them to run faster and longer than sprawling reptiles. Their lungs, likely supported by bird-like air sacs, gave them stamina even in low oxygen conditions. Their reproductive strategies, laying clutches of eggs, allowed them to rebound quickly after population crashes. Their diets, varied and flexible, made them less vulnerable to sudden shortages. They had been training for survival in the hardest of worlds, and when the hardest of tests arrived, they were ready. But dominance is not just about filling empty spaces. It is also about creating new ones. Dinosaurs reshaped their environments as they spread. Herds of sauropodomorphs trampled forests, opening gaps that allowed new plants to grow. Theropods controlled populations of herbivores, keeping ecosystems balanced. Even their dung recycled nutrients back into the soil, fertilizing forests that fed the next generation. By simply living in such numbers and sizes, dinosaurs altered the landscapes around them, ensuring that their supremacy reinforced itself. The takeover was global. Because Pangaea was still largely united, dinosaurs could spread without barriers. Species that arose in South America could eventually migrate into North America, Africa, or Europe. Their adaptability made them suited to deserts, coasts, and forests alike. Wherever plants grew and prey moved, dinosaurs followed. Within a short span of time, they were not confined to one corner of the world. They were the world. It's easy to imagine what this must have looked like. A Triassic floodplain once dominated by Rowisuchians and armoured herbivores, now filled with herds of Plateosaurus browsing at shoulder height, their long necks reaching into conifers. Along the edges of rivers, Colophysis-like hunters darting after small prey, their movements too quick for the eye to follow, larger theropods pacing through forests, their footprints sinking deep into the mud. The soundtrack of insects and amphibians still humming, but now layered with the constant presence of dinosaurs, their calls echoing across valleys. The shadows were gone. They were everywhere. The rise of dinosaurs also meant the shrinking of others. Mammal ancestors remained small, their opportunities limited by the new rulers. Amphibians persisted only in scattered habitats, no longer giants, but reduced to modest forms. Crocodile relatives survived, but their diversity narrowed, leaving only the semi-aquatic lifestyles we still see today. Each of these survivors carved out niches, but none could challenge the dinosaurs' dominance. The takeover was not complete annihilation of rivals, but it was a reshuffling of power, with dinosaurs now sitting firmly at the top. This transformation reminds us how fragile and contingent history is. Dinosaurs did not win because they were guaranteed to. They won because catastrophe cleared the field, and they were best equipped to seize the chance. Their supremacy was the product of survival, adaptability, and timing. For millions of years they had been little more than survivors, waiting in the shadows. Then the earth shifted, the skies darkened, and when the world brightened again, they stood unchallenged. From that moment, their story was no longer one of fragility. It was one of expansion, innovation, and resilience. For the next 135 million years, they would be the dominant animals of Earth, evolving into forms stranger and grander than anything the Triassic had hinted at. But it all began here, in the quiet transformation from shadows to dominance, when survival tipped into supremacy and the dynasty of dinosaurs truly began. The Triassic ended not with quiet, but with upheaval. Volcanoes split the sky, ash and gas reshaped climates, and whole lineages disappeared into extinction. When the dust settled, the world that emerged was no longer the one that had been. It was the dawn of the Jurassic, a new chapter in Earth's story, and waiting beyond that threshold was a horizon unlike anything life had ever known. The world that waited for the survivors of the Triassic was vast, fertile, and ready to be reshaped. For dinosaurs, it was not just a continuation. It was an invitation to expand into every niche the planet offered. The continents were still fused in the supercontinent of Pangaea, though the first signs of its fracture had already begun. Rift valleys split open in what is now the Atlantic, and the slow drift of tectonic plates was underway. But in the early Jurassic, the land was still connected, and this connectivity allowed life to spread across enormous distances. Dinosaurs, already hardened by the struggles of the Triassic, were positioned to take advantage of this unity. Where their rivals had fallen, they spread step by step, herd by herd, footprint by footprint until they filled entire landscapes. The Jurassic horizon was greener than much of the Triassic had been. With climate stabilising after the chaos of eruptions, forests flourished. Conifers dominated, their tall trunks and spreading canopies creating new layers of habitat. Cycads and ginkgos stood among them, while ferns carpeted the ground. Horsetails clustered along riverbanks, their reed-like stalks reaching into the air. Grasses and flowers had not yet evolved, so the landscapes were alien by modern standards, but they were also lush in their own way, a continuous sea of foliage that fed an explosion of herbivores. For dinosaurs, this green world meant opportunity. The early sauropodomorphs of the Triassic, like Plateosaurus, gave way to larger and more specialised forms. Their necks lengthened, their bodies grew massive, and they began to exploit food sources far above the reach of other animals. Herds of these giants spread across floodplains, stripping trees and reshaping forests with every step. The Jurassic would become the age of sauropods, animals so immense that even the Triassic could not have hinted at their scale. These giants were not yet at their peak in the early Jurassic, but their trajectory was already clear. Predators followed. Theropods that had once been modest hunters in the Triassic grew into larger and more formidable carnivores. Their bodies adapted for speed and power, their teeth sharpened for tearing into the flesh of enormous prey. The balance of predator and prey shifted to new scales, with both sides pushing the boundaries of size and strategy. Fossil trackways from the Jurassic show groups of predators moving across ancient mudflats, their footprints preserved alongside those of the herds they hunted. The echoes of their pursuit linger in the stones, the oceans too transformed. While ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs had dominated Triassic seas, the Jurassic opened new opportunities for marine reptiles. Plesiosaurs spread with their long necks and paddle-like limbs, gliding through waters in search of fish and ammonites. Ichthyosaurs continued to thrive, streamlined like dolphins, chasing prey across open seas. Ammonites themselves rebounded after the extinction, evolving into countless new forms that coiled in intricate spirals. The marine world was just as vibrant as the land, filled with predators and prey, all adapted to the new rhythms of the Jurassic. The skies began to change as well. Pterosaurs, which had first appeared in the late Triassic, expanded rapidly in the Jurassic. Their wings carried them across coastlines and rivers, fishing from the air, scavenging carcasses, and perhaps even hunting small prey on land. Some were small, no larger than birds, while others grew into wingspans that dwarfed any modern bird. They were the first vertebrates to claim the skies fully, long before birds evolved, and their dominance in the air paralleled the dinosaurs' rise on the ground. What made the Jurassic horizon so extraordinary was not just the creatures themselves, but the scale of life's rebuilding. The extinction at the end of the Triassic had been brutal, clearing away much of what had existed. But life rebounds, and the Jurassic was that rebound on a grand scale. Ecosystems grew larger, more complex, more stable. The survivors of the Triassic were no longer clinging to existence, they were flourishing. Dinosaurs were the most visible beneficiaries, but mammals, crocodiles, amphibians and insects all carved out their roles in this new world. The chorus of life was louder, more layered and more enduring. The fossil record of the Jurassic gives us snapshots of this horizon. Petrified forests preserve entire stands of trees, their trunks still rooted where they grew. Bone beds capture herds of sauropods, buried together in floods or volcanic ash, their massive skeletons testaments to their scale. Footprints stretch across ancient floodplains, showing paths where herds and hunters once moved. In marine deposits, ammonites and ichthyosaurs lie side by side, their shells and bones recording the richness of the seas. Each fossil is a fragment of the horizon that opened after the Triassic, a glimpse into the world that dinosaurs would inherit fully. The Jurassic was not without its challenges. Volcanoes still erupted, climates still shifted, and predators still tested every prey animal's defences. But compared to the restless extremes of the Triassic, the Jurassic offered more stability. more room for expansion. It was a canvas wide open, and dinosaurs painted themselves across it in every form imaginable. Their supremacy was no longer fragile. It was established, visible in every footprint, every skeleton, every trace. To stand at the threshold between Triassic and Jurassic would have been to see contrast in stark relief. Behind you, a world of struggle, of small dinosaurs darting in shadows, of rivals vying for power in a restless climate. Before you, a horizon of giants, of forests reshaped by herds, of seas filled with new hunters, of skies alive with wings. The world that waited was larger, greener and richer, and it was ready for the dynasty that had survived the darkness. The Jurassic horizon was not just the next chapter, it was the true beginning of the age of dinosaurs as we imagine it. The small, fragile survivors of the Triassic had endured catastrophe, and now they stepped into a world built for their expansion. Their takeover was complete, and the horizon stretched endlessly before them. If you could stand beneath the night sky of the Triassic, you would see something both familiar and unfamiliar. The stars themselves would be the same, the constellation shifted slightly by time, but shining with the same cold light, scattered across the same black canvas. Above you, the Milky Way would still stretch like a band of pale mist, a reminder of the vastness beyond Earth. What would feel different would be everything beneath those stars. The forests, the deserts, the rivers, the creatures, the very air in your lungs. And yet to pause there, beneath that ancient sky, is to realize that all of it, every insect hum, every reptile call, every step of a dinosaur on soft soil, was part of the same long story we still inhabit. The stars have seen it all. The Triassic was a time of fragility and renewal. It began in silence, in the aftermath of the greatest extinction the Earth had ever known. Nearly all complex life had been erased at the end of the Permian, leaving behind a wounded planet. Slowly, painfully, life returned. Plants spread their roots into red soils, insects buzzed across floodplains, amphibians croaked in shallow rivers. Reptiles tested new shapes, some growing armoured shells, others stretching their limbs into efficient strides. Dinosaurs appeared almost quietly, small and forgettable at first, their presence just one more experiment in a world already full of experiments. For tens of millions of years, nothing about them suggested destiny. Crurotarsans seemed stronger. Amphibians still claimed the waterways. Mammal ancestors endured in their burrows, modest but resilient. Dinosaurs were only shadows in the background, their steps light and their lives uncertain. Yet survival is its own kind of strength, and as the Triassic world buckled under volcanoes and climate swings, their adaptability became the one trait that mattered most. When the skies darkened in the Great Extinction at the end of the period, it was dinosaurs who emerged in greater numbers than before. Survival became supremacy, and supremacy would carry them into the next age. To look back on that now is to see more than just bones in stone. It is to see the delicate balance of chance and resilience that shapes every life. Dinosaurs did not conquer their world by sheer might. They inherited it because they were prepared, even unknowingly, for catastrophe. They had lungs efficient enough to handle thin air, postures strong enough to travel across deserts, diets flexible enough to endure scarcity. They had patience written into their biology, the patience to wait out rivals, the patience to endure until the Earth itself gave them the stage. And the Triassic was not only about dinosaurs, it was about the forests of conifers that stood without flowers, about cycads that spread leathery leaves into the heat, about ginkgos whose fan-shaped foliage still grows in our cities today. It was about insects rebuilding their numbers, beetles chewing wood, dragonflies flashing across rivers. It was about amphibians holding on, their croaks echoing against the backdrop of deserts and monsoons. It was about crocodile kin that nearly became the rulers of Earth, only to be undone by extinction's roll of the dice. The Triassic was not a single story, but 1,000, woven together under skies that burned red with dust by day and shimmered with starlight by night. When we think of time on this scale, it can feel overwhelming. Hundreds of millions of years, entire lineages rising and falling, continents moving like slow rivers of rock. And yet, beneath the stars, it is also intimate. A Kelophysis chasing an insect across a riverbank, its feet pressing into soft mud. A Plateosaurus stretching its neck to reach needles at the top of a conifer. A small mammal ancestor scurrying into a burrow, carrying food in its cheek pouches. Each of these lives was lived in moments no different from ours, with breaths drawn, choices made, risks taken. They did not know they were part of something vast. They simply lived. The stars above the Triassic watched it all unfold. They saw the silence after the Permian extinction. They saw the return of green to barren soil. They saw reptiles rise, forests spread, insects swarm. They saw the eruptions that darkened the skies and the extinctions that followed. They saw dinosaurs step into the roles that would define the Mesozoic. And in those same stars, if you look up tonight, you see what they saw. The constellations may be different in arrangement, shifted by the slow drift of time, but the light is the same. We share the sky with the Triassic. This is what reflection beneath ancient stars can give us, the sense that we are not separate from this story, but part of it. The same Earth that struggled through fire and silence then is the Earth beneath our feet now. The same sky that looked down on Plateosaurus looks down on us. The same resilience that carried life forward carries us too. The Triassic is not gone. It echoes in the ginkgos that still unfurl their leaves each spring, in the crocodiles that bask on riverbanks, in the birds that fill our skies, their wings the legacy of feathered dinosaurs. Even in ourselves, mammals whose ancestors once hid in shadows, there is an echo of that ancient age. And perhaps that is why the Triassic matters, even though it lies so far back in time. It reminds us that dominance is fragile, that survival is never guaranteed, that every empire of life is built first on the ability to endure. It reminds us that catastrophe reshapes worlds, but also that life returns, stubborn and inventive, ready to fill whatever space is left. The Triassic was an age of beginnings, of experiments, of resilience tested and rewarded. Beneath its stars, the blueprint of the Mesozoic was written, and we are still living in the chapters that followed. So picture yourself there, lying on red desert sand, a warm wind carrying the scent of conifers, the calls of distant reptiles drifting through the night. Above you, the stars blaze, the same stars you know. Around you, life hums with fragility and promise. Dinosaurs are only shadows now, but their footsteps are already pressing into history. The world is restless, volatile, alive with change. And in the silence between the sounds of insects and the crackle of shifting earth, you can almost hear it, the beginning of an empire that will last for ages. The Triassic ends, the Jurassic waits, and the stars remain. Ancient witnesses, unblinking, constant, casting their light on worlds that rise and fall beneath them. They watch the dinosaurs take their first uncertain steps. They watch them seize supremacy. And they watch us now, as we look back, trying to remember what it meant when survival became destiny, and when destiny unfolded beneath ancient stars.